Mediation as God. Epilogue. The West lies in the Occident, on the freedom and tide of feeling, for a higher history than all history before.
Quote, Israel must stop trying to be Europe in the Middle East culturally and instead become a cultural power in the Middle East. End of quote. Strangely enough, no one took offense at this sentence from a speech by Gregor Gysi, the parliamentary leader of the Left Party in the German Bundestag. Rather, it was noted with approval that Gysi had declared war on anti-Zionism in the party with his lecture. It is not surprising that the center of society did not want to notice anything, but where was the criticism from those circles to which Bahamas expressly does not belong, for whom solidarity with Israel is so close to their hearts that they seek the broadest social alliance against the Iranian mullah regime? Gysi's sentence is an insult to the Jewish people and their history. It is also a mockery of what Europe once was and, together with other Western countries, could once be. And it is also the ideological surrender not only of Israel to, for example, Iran, but also of the West in general to the Orient. For what do the Jews and their state stand for? To quote a philosopher who, according to Adorno, was dark, whose lightning-quick intelligence almost makes his occasional madness and spleen forgotten, it is for this. In the darkest times of the Middle Ages, when the Asian cloud had settled heavily over Europe, it was Jewish freethinkers, scholars and doctors who held the banner of enlightenment and intellectual independence under the harshest personal duress and defended Europe against Asia. It is thanks to their efforts, not least, that a more natural, rational, and, in any case, unmythical explanation of the world could finally triumph again, and that the ring of culture, which now connects us with the enlightenment of Greek and Roman antiquity, remained unbroken. If Christianity has done everything to orientalize the Occident, Judaism has essentially helped to occidentalize it again and again. How far would practicing friends of Israel follow these considerations of Friedrich Nietzsche? I fear not at all. The distinction between Orient and Occident as intellectual spheres is only possible if people make it in a biased way, no matter in which corner of the world this explicit judgment of the culture of the Orient is made. To pass a judgment of worthlessness on its constitution, its ideology, which is particularly shaped by religion, and its treatment of the individual subject to its rule, demands more than to administer cinematic educational tracts to the Berlin Biennale audience on the occasion of an Iranian film about Ahmadinejad's career. Taking Nietzsche at his word would mean recognizing that we are dealing with an unmythical explanation of the world that must be victorious and with a bond that holds together modern enlightenment with ancient Greek and Roman thought. To affirm this and, against this background, to do justice to the historical role of the Jews and the current role of the State of Israel in the confrontation between the Orient and the Occident would mean recognizing something that is basically completely banal, that Israel, through its very existence, must of course be Europe's cultural presence in the Middle East, if it does not want to surrender to a culture that has made its own destruction its program. But that is not happening in Germany. Germany, which set about the extermination of European Jews after it had first orientalized itself, is known to have become part of the West only after 1945, formally and superficially, through the pressure of the Western Allies, the loss of the Eastern territories, the separation of the essentially Prussian Protestant GDR, and a historical exception in political responsibility. Konrad Adenauer. A very hollow and barely self-aware West, however. The forces of the Orient, however, remained powerful. They ranged from a falsification of history that outlasted its author Joseph Goebbels, who had the number of those killed in Dresden in February 1945 multiplied by 10 in order to prove the downfall of the German West by the Anglo-American bombing terror with 250,000 dead. And then to the British Nazi David Irving, whose book, The Destruction of Dresden, was published by Rowohlt in the mid-1960s and became a West German bestseller. The brothers and sisters in the East did not need this book at all, as they had adopted Goebbels's diction about the Anglo-American bombing terror one-to-one. And when the liberated city of Dresden now officially and publicly commemorates its dead from the bombing war, and the Nazis feel encouraged to hold their largest rally in a long time, it becomes evident that civilization, enlightenment, culture, or simply Europe, when translated into German ideology, is at least as far to the east as the thinking and actions of the two friends of the former chancellor, Putin and Ahmadinejad. Shouldn't we be protesting against the mufti of the Karl Liebknecht house wherever he appears, accusing him of betraying Israel and thus civilization? Isn't Gregor Gysi more dangerous than his colleague Norman Page, who has been sidelined, or Gerhard Schroeder, precisely because he is not considered an anti-imperialist crank or a bought and paid for trade representative of totalitarianism, but rather celebrates anti-Semitism in keeping with the times by vilifying the West with the Jews. What could be called Western civilization has almost completely sunk, becoming part of an unloved and misunderstood past, to which we nevertheless owe our existence. It is dead, unloved ballast, which we perceive as an annoying reminder that sometimes touches us, strangely enough, in the sum of our own way of life, the prosperity we have achieved, the freedom we have realized. It is perhaps the shock of comparing the role of Western women in society with that of their new neighbors from parallel societies, which not only reveals the enormous progress made in emancipation, but also allows something like outrage to arise in a weak moment in a cultural relativist who has not yet become completely hardened. Outrage that is fueled by a sense of responsibility, indeed by the obligation not to tolerate it. Not to tolerate it because one must allow others to share in the little that one enjoys after all, and in which one almost wants to suffocate, in that brief moment of shock. Now, Western civilization, this process of liberation from the bondage to nature and from surrendering to predestined fate, which was only completed by the victory of capitalism, is by no means to be measured only by the actual results, this less arbitrariness, the small increase in social security and the large increase in prosperity. According to the understanding of its proponents, people who have long been dead and almost exclusively not Germans, the process of civilization was to lead to the liberated human being, who, living in a meaningful order, voluntarily and reasonably engages with others and actively develops the possibilities slumbering within him. Civilization, the West, had set out to realize a universal context of meaning beyond gender and origin, which had previously only been founded on religion, without attaching to it any ideas of the hereafter that had become questionable, and now to do so in a rational way, that is, according to the measure of man. This included the still unfulfilled claim to make oneself equal to the murdered God, starting with the day on which it was no longer to be doubted that the earth and its inhabitants were no more than an insignificant coincidence in the boundless senselessness of the universe. This goes hand in hand with the obligation to hold on to this world as the center of all human endeavor, as if the stars and planets continued to revolve around the earth as their center, as if the Ptolemaic worldview were still a scientifically recognized fact. To stay with Nietzsche. If today in a Berlin park some Bible-believing Christian with his Jesus Lives poster invites people to the nearest Adventist community, the defiantly stupid addition scrawled in marker pen, "God is dead," is never missing. Nietzsche had his famous statement proclaimed by the madman, who ran across the market square at midday with a burning lantern and the cry, "I seek God."
I seek Gud.
God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How do we console ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? The most sacred and most powerful thing that the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe the blood from us? With what water could we cleanse ourselves? What atonement ceremonies, what sacred games will we have to invent? Is not the magnitude of this deed too great for us? Must we not become gods ourselves in order to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us will belong to a higher history than all history has been hitherto, for the sake of this deed. End of quote. Compare this with the credo of today's self-satisfied atheists, who like to vent their anger at the Catholic Church, which does not want to be satisfied with a simple and cunning "Jesus lives," but seeks to maintain a theological and sometimes philosophical edifice in a politically often obscure way, which the Protestant competition has already abandoned. When Nietzsche's madman exclaims, "What are the churches if they are not the tombs and monuments of God?" he must have been thinking of the Catholic ones. For the Protestant churches have long since become places of need for the organizers of atonement ceremonies and sacred games, the purpose of which is not to prepare for the higher history that humanity would have to enter after the murder of God, but rather to provide public rituals of apology for having once adhered to a universal claim to truth. This is accompanied by the assurance that nothing comparable will ever be thought again. The lasting desecration of God's tombs unites a Protestantism that publicly reflects on whether missionary work is a sin with those all-too-common atheists who, in addition to their "God is dead" mantra, can only think of the outrageous claim that the world was a happy place before religion came along, and that the abolition of religion is therefore the order of the day. With Piggy Smart from an atheist children's book in which all monotheistic religions are mocked in a nice and even way, in reality Christianity and Judaism, it sounds like this: Piglet, I now know what we have been missing all this time. What then? Asked the little piglet. Without God, we had no fear, said the hedgehog. That's right, said the piglet. But did you miss the fear? No, replied the little hedgehog. End of quote. So much for life without fear in godless times. It was probably very difficult to break out into a seemingly enigmatic lament about the murder of God before the end of the 19th century, as Nietzsche did, because until then everything had been done from the crypts of God to force the corpse as a living being on the people for worship, and it was more important to defend oneself against such impositions than to reflect on the loss. All attempts to revive religion not because of, but despite the denial of the natural sciences as a pseudo-naive exuberance of the soul proved to be so tasteless that it seemed more important to declare war on the spiritual marching rations for the search for meaning after work, which is offered in esoteric form today, together with its Protestant and Catholic propagandists, than to devote oneself to the last things. It is understandable why Karl Marx was not interested in the essence of Christianity or Judaism. His opponents were not the representatives of the official church, but rather literary figures and political sect leaders who did not want to break out of religious logic and prevent others from criticizing it. But even Ludwig Buchner's vulgar materialist book Kraft und die Stoff, published in 1855, which later became a bestseller for the social democratic worker, would have been just as alien to him as endorsing the age-old aberrations of his friend Engels. With his dialectic of nature, he bridged the movements of thought and human history with those in nature, unintentionally contributing to a materialistic substitute religion whose highest being must have been a chemist. Marx had always admired the highly vital creations of the dead God and, with an annoying persistence for later socialists and communists, had drawn on the Old and New Testaments as an almost immeasurable fund of universal thinking, not of evidence, but of developed thinking that did not yet distinguish between the spheres of exemplary narrative, philosophical parable, and proclaimed law. Marx also knew that the legacy of religion in the West had not only migrated into metaphysics, but also into art. Generations of Marx disciples have been wondering why William Shakespeare is so frequently quoted in the first volume of Capital, but not only there, right after the Bible. Quotations from his work and that of other classics serve to illustrate abstract relationships that can only be partially traced back to their crazy material basis with the language of strict conceptualization. And they did not enter into Capital as a result of linguistic inability, but rather as a result of an anti-religious, but nonetheless deeply poetic imagination, possibly out of a need to banish all too systematic temptation, but certainly out of enthusiasm for religious or poetic explanations of the world, in which realism, naivety, and the effort to find comfort in the magic of language have come together to convey human experience and hope. Explanations of the world in which necessarily false thinking was led to the truth by surprisingly clear-sighted images, a truth that has come closer to the idea of the universal human race, especially through the consolation of the individual in the face of fear and death, than almost anything that has followed in the enlightened centuries. Although, after the betrayed revolution that so thoroughly sullied the name of communism that it borders on the presumptuous to want to continue to offer this promise, which in practice almost only stood for mass murder, misery, and spiritual dulling, a Neo-Ptolemaic worldview, the West, can only be justified if it is held to its completion, which must be communist. For just as much as non-communist Western civilization experienced its final barbaric grimace in National Socialism, precisely when the all-destructive German result had nothing at all to do with a bourgeois republic and capitalist competition, and yet had developed from both forms, so little can the Stalinist, Maoist, etc. horror can be blamed on those who recognized communism as the only salvation from the preordained downfall of the human race and thus strove for nothing less than to save the principle of competition at the higher level of human comparison, without reinforcing a hierarchy that ranges from those entitled to life to those unworthy of life. Today, in the West, the state of socialization, which is by no means accidental, is hardly considered to be something that has been worked out and fought for, let alone something that has been thought out, painted, or written about in advance. And the idea of the downfall is almost being painted with relish, as soon as the share prices have fallen by 50%. What communism was once supposed to overcome, the endless drudgery, the bleak life plans, the constant fear of economic ruin and death, does not mean the opening of an age of no less bleak idleness in a state of complete collective equality, in which even the sexual act would become boring for lack of individual actors, as is already being exemplified today by the pseudo-communist ideals of self-proclaimed revolutionaries. Although everyone is in a state of panic, staging wild farces of what competition could be even in capitalism, they are so preoccupied with their imagined struggle for survival that they are hardly able to recognize each other anymore. And yet the degenerate pseudo-communist goal, which a 1960 film adaptation of H.G. Wells' Time Machine, with Rod Taylor in the lead role satirized in a trashy but convincing way, has long since become an expression of a godforsaken utopia and, in part, even the existential condition of the inhabitants of the West. In the film version of The Time Machine, an Arcadia appears in which half-naked beauties of both sexes, who amuse themselves with each other without ever leaving the pack, abandon themselves to idleness at bubbling springs, but go to their certain doom like remote-controlled robots at the call of fate. The call of fate sounds from the steam whistles of the man-eating Morlocks, the subterranean operators of this not-so-natural Arcadia, in whose slaughterhouse the Arcadian people silently enter until another steam whistle closes the gates of hell again and releases those who have not yet been admitted this time until the next time. The West, civilization, and its original promise, communism, were and are not calls to individuals to finally let go. On the contrary, individuals should be helped to finally raise their voices as the masters of their own interests, and their interests should not be an expression of their social arbitrariness, but should be brought into harmony with a reasonable general interest, a process that I would like to call the education of the human race with Lessing, and beyond Lessing, the self-education of the human race on a voluntary basis to a life without fear. This means activity, openness to the world around us, the envious recognition of the individual achievements of others, and, at the same time, the incentive to be productive for one's own sake and for the sake of others. But it also means no compulsory obligation to take state or socially imposed hurdles like an obedient racehorse, but only to do what one's own insight can bring into harmony with generally set liberation. It is about a promise that decisively rejects any form of community that is the opposite of the association of free people, for the sake of a utopia that does not deny the history of mankind, that recognizes the natural fate of man, but revolts against it. It rejects the puritanical forms of lifelong self-discipline just as much as the inherent, essentially death-seeking tendency to submit to a supposedly appropriate illusory nature, as represented by the Morlocks, who no longer need steam whistles because they can rely on the call of the muezzin, which, if the current crisis continues to spread, could soon be the call of all kinds of community priests, who will no longer be recognizable as right-wing or left-wing extremists, or as representatives of the center of society. The West, in the form of late capitalist societies, is indisputably no longer able to convey meaning, unless it is that all the alternatives currently on offer, whether utopian or even somewhere on the periphery of state become reality, only hold terror in store. A state or, increasingly, a gang of horrors that finally relieves the individual of any effort to explore the meaning of his life, or the meaning of the society in which he ekes out a living, or even that of the world in which it all takes place. To stay with the image of the H.G. Wells film, the Arcadia that the Europeans long for cannot be attained without the Morlocks. Delegating self-government to an eternal principle that is beyond criticism gives rise to cannibals. To court a beautiful woman or a beautiful man is an effort that one should not, of course, let on, nor is it an effort to recognize natural beauty, or simply not to give up on oneself. The enjoyment, the fulfillment, flies away just as little as the life that one is given in the most creaturely sense. But to make something out of it that deserves the name of life requires activity, productivity, and the courage to take risks. The defeats, which often consist of not even having tried to succeed, can be easily compensated for. In a novel by the equally great Charles Dickens, poorly compensated defeat is presented as spite. The hero, who has not fared so badly materially or otherwise, meets the object of his youth's affection 20 years later, who has spurned him. Now it is she who has aged much faster than he, who is abandoned and materially far worse off, who courts him as a caricature of what she once was, and he is the one who now spurns her. This revenge is cheap because it is no longer the adored one that he rejects, and yet the need for malice, depicted in the caricature, expresses a defense that testifies to the fact that a disappointment has been expressed as a lifelong insult and has never been processed. The spitefulness towards a civilization that has failed to deliver on its great promises, as it has become a basic attitude in Europe, expresses the petty hatred of those who have been spurned, who only want to recognize the undeniable decline of the idol of the past and yet have to seal themselves off from the promise that still shines through the ruins, the distorted image, in order to at least be able to exist in front of themselves. For what remains of the West is the constant, painful reminder that instead of wasting one's life in the blind bustle of the struggle for existence, one could do something else, which admittedly requires effort and activity. The tormenting memory that one should distinguish between leisure and that laziness that is so busily filled with work and everyday obligations that one does not even realize that one is doing nothing. That one should work for the sake of oneself, first at the dawn of a higher history than all history so far. The weariness of these efforts, which has turned into malice, seeks a way out in two seemingly opposite extremes, which are nevertheless expressions of the same thing. There is the invocation of mediocrity as the necessary modesty, and there is the cult of genius, which has always had something of the cult of the leader. The heralds never do justice to the ideal they proclaim. They are immodest when they proclaim mediocrity and avowedly mediocre when they pay homage to genius. The promotion of mediocrity is the business of esotericists who, together with others, imagine themselves to be a collective genius, but inwardly watch over each other to ensure that none of them breaks out. Those who pay homage to genius do so in order to warm themselves at its sun, but were always concerned with making themselves equal to the idol or overthrowing it. However, they have been largely relieved of this for a good century, because the geniuses of the 20th and 21st centuries, insofar as they are involved in public affairs, are from the outset flesh of their admirers, whose concentrated will to inhumanity they merely represent. When mediocrity is attacked, it is usually due to a misunderstanding. The hatred of mediocrity only partly referred to the comfortable way of life of the German bourgeoisie after 1870. The career of the magazine Simplicissimus, founded in 1896, from its allegedly radical fight against Philistinism to its role as a propaganda magazine for the German War of Conquest from August 1914 onwards, testifies to the belief, apparently held from the outset, in the higher calling of the Germans, who were described as Philistines, in a state of emergency that was apparently no longer mediocre. The lives of the French petit bourgeois, characterized by paranoid avarice, were also only partly the focus of criticism, whose inhumanity Balzac commemorated in his little-known novel Perret, 1843. For these petit bourgeois were also driven by the urge to achieve something greater when, from 1850 onwards, they cheered a nephew and farcical doppelganger of Napoleon Bonaparte who wanted to bestow glory on their existence. The contempt for mediocrity then typically turns into resentment when it is directed against Great Britain and, to a greater extent, the United States, because in both countries, for reasons that are in part quite similar, neither the cult of genius nor the associated mediocrity of the subject's allegiance have made history. The pronounced sense of privacy of the bourgeoisie there was always coupled with mistrust of the geniuses of statecraft, those matadors of the state of emergency that one did not want. There is nothing glorious about the bourgeois retreat of Anglo-Saxon provenance, which ennobles it, and at the same time it remains as a life plan just as imperfect as the society in which it takes place. Their alternative is the heroic genius, who in the early bourgeois era was perhaps able to express the hope of his contemporaries for improvement in his person. As a man of destiny, blessed by fortune, as a social character of a new era, a type of new man, and as an executor of a new order, a real helper in the implementation of overdue reforms. However, the tendency towards arbitrariness, crudeness, excess, and painfully pompous self-dramatization is just as much a part of their nature as their constant plebiscitary appeals to the people. In this respect, what Sigmund Freud wrote in a letter to Arnold Zweig in 1934 applies to Napoleon Bonaparte. This great scoundrel Napoleon, who, fixated on his adolescent fantasies, favored by incredible luck, unhampered by any ties other than to his family, fluttered through the world like a sleepwalker, only to finally shatter in megalomania. There has hardly ever been a genius who was so alien to all traces of nobility, a classic anti-gentleman, but he had great stature. End of quote. Napoleon was the last genius of the state of emergency, in whose person and work not only the great catastrophe was inherent, but also the great throe. When it became evident that the French Revolution had been betrayed once and for all by an officer of the Revolution who had risen to become the dictator of the bourgeoisie with monarchist aspirations and who surrendered in a most unheroic manner, one of the most perceptive poets of the time, Lord Byron, turned to a completely different country. Byron asked himself the question, "Where may the wearied eye repose when gazing on the great where neither guilty glory glows nor despicable state? Where may the wearied eye repose when gazing on the great where neither guilty glory glows nor despicable state. And he came up with the following remarkable answer. Yes, one, the first, the last, the best, the Cincinnatus of the West, whom envy dared not hate, bequeathed the name of Washington, to make man blush there was but one. End of quote. This decidedly British rejection of the idolized hero, a hero whom Byron, in view of his fall in March 1814, initially accused most vehemently in the same Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte of not having killed himself like other so-called heroes, then turns to another hero who would be the last until humanity is ready to dispense with this concept or finally make it its own. As a war hero and statesman, Washington had done what the ancient Cincinnatus had already done, and after accomplishing his task, he returned to his estates instead of having himself proclaimed dictator for life. Perhaps this also explains why a later major city in the USA, which was known as Fort Washington during the Civil War, was renamed Cincinnati shortly after the Union victory. Where reason, including the reason of the state, is expressed in the seemingly unregulated, genius is at play, whereas the cult of the written law already carries within it a petty and narrow-minded regulatory frenzy that extends from the possibly reasonable legal purpose to the expedient citizen. Anglo-Saxon law as case law, which has far fewer texts than French or German law, and yet is not arbitrary law because it incorporates and develops the experiences of a constantly changing society, remains true to the few statutes that, minus a few amendments, go back to Washington and his contemporaries and that, to this day, prevent the total state from being proclaimed by a totalitarian society. This is directed against the arbitrariness of a so-called Great Order, as Bertolt Brecht celebrated Soviet industrialization under the regime of Stalinism, and it speaks out in favor of the unfinished and improvised, in which something of genius is preserved, just as in the desire for withdrawal from all too pompously celebrated responsibility for the homeland, so admired by Byron in Washington. For narrow, small-minded, and authoritarian conditions are often recognizable in the regulated and circumscribed monstrosity that the banlieues built by the French welfare state since the 1950s represent, or in the Kreuzberg tenement block Biedermeier idyll, which is devoid of any sense of form, and not in the skyscrapers of Manhattan and Chicago, which at least reach for the stars. The American middle class, the social average, has retained little more of the genius of a different projection of freedom than the legacy of the French Revolution on the continent, other than the private dream of a thing which in turn can only be realized in escapades, the great and small escapes of Harry Angstrom, for example, the protagonist of John Updike's 4 major rabbit novels, which appeared between 1960 and 1990. Israel must stop trying to be Europe in the Middle East and become a cultural power in the Middle East, said party leader Jaisai, obviously warning against hubris. He was not talking about the dead dog that Europe has become, not least through the actions of his peers in the state parties of the East and the social democracies of the West, but rather in a shuddering realization of what it once was, and thus from the hearts of those who, as true freethinkers, not only cheekily place the 2 Testaments on a par with the Quran, but have long since decided that they cannot understand the meaning of Gregor Jaisai's anti-Semitic imperative. They will not therefore be willing to go beyond Lord Byron's bow to George Washington as a representative of the political alternative to the European-influenced West, and to say with Nietzsche what concerns all communists. What is the point of genius if it does not communicate such freedom and elevation of feeling to its observer and admirer that he no longer needs genius? To make oneself superfluous, that is the glory of all great men. End of quote. Applied to the Israel and the so-called Jewish question, it would mean that it is not the Jews who have to assimilate themselves to the East, but that the Jews first find so many observers and admirers in the West that the curse of the Orient is lifted from them, along with the historical burden that forces them to constantly communicate the freedom and height of feeling to unwilling members of the Occident. Helping to make this happen is our central task above all others. Spengler's incantation of the decline of the West was already ambiguous. A warning against decadence and a barely concealed wish that the Judeo-Christian civilization might finally come to an end. Where today the mouthpieces of civil society invoke religious freedom in order to court Islam of all things the only religion that not only has not been able to achieve the internalization and privatization of faith that turns a confession into a denomination, but has also aggressively refused to do so, there is once again a Spengler-like obsession with decline, badly disguised with the claim to defend a civil right, because it is precisely this right that serves Islam to establish its counter-society in conformity with the law. The obvious need for the Occident to orient itself towards itself must be countered by the fact that no defense of the West can be achieved without defending the Occident, because Western secularism and the internalization of faith as a private matter for individuals were achievements of the great Occidental religions, which Islam, for which faith and barbaric acts coincide, is declaring war on. For this very reason, criticism of Islam is not a variant of criticism of religion, but rather a defense of Jewish Christian thought and life against a form of belief that has not yet managed to become theology, that is, to elevate its own nature to the object of reflection and criticism. The debates currently being conducted by the political mainstream on the future social treatment of Islam and its adherents make one thing clear again and again. The left is not, and increasingly categorically not, open to criticism of religion in the sense of Marx, Freud, and Adorno. The real left is divided into two camps. On the one hand, there are those who cannot make it comfortable enough for the practice of Islam in the name of anti-racism, whereby the Islamophilia they display corresponds to a pronounced anti-Christian resentment that suggests a healthy dose of self-hatred. On the other hand, and the so-called left-wing anti-Germans are to be counted among them, there are village atheists for whom laicism is the most advanced, and, especially in Germany, still to be realized form of secular separation of state and religion. This means a consequent equal treatment and thus also equalization of all religions and their symbols, whether one appreciates the Abrahamic religions equally in principle, for whatever reason, against the background of the completely misunderstood Lessing's ring parable, or rather equally mistrusts them as a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder, superstition, expression of black pedagogy, etc. According to this camp, practical criticism of Islam, such as banning headscarves in schools and public offices, would only be tolerated or welcomed if the cross and kippah were also removed from the corresponding rooms. If the state were to do away with the remnants of privileged treatment of Christianity, i.e. if it were to stop collecting church taxes, revoke the church's status as public corporations, remove their representatives from advisory boards and committees of broadcasting corporations, and so on. On the other hand, conservatives and right-wingers or right-wing populists are accused by the very same leftists and, in particular, left-wing anti-Germans of two contrary tendencies that are in fact marginal and instead are mainly encountered among Nazis who are currently marginalized: the external use of enlightened criticism of Islam for base xenophobic racism and a love-hate relationship with Islam that is fueled by envy of Islam. In other words, from the assumption that Islam still has authentic religiousness or an intact gender relationship which is belittled as conservative, that Muslims still have something like a healthy cultural identity and, in general, that they are, as Nietzsche already aired in The Antichrist, who did not recognize their penis envy, real men, uninhibited by a Christian conscience that softens them. Or in Hitler's words, if Charles Martel had not won at Poitiers, if we had already taken on the Jewish world, Christianity is so boring, we would have much rather taken on Islam, this doctrine of the reward of heroism. The fighter alone has the seventh heaven. The Germans would have conquered the world with it. Only Christianity has prevented us from doing so. End of quote. The currently hegemonic conservative criticism of Islam by the CSU and the official AfD has nothing to do with either of these tendencies in the debates they have recently initiated. Islam does not belong to Germany. Headscarf ban for schoolgirls and compulsory crosses in Bavarian offices. The practical result, the effect of such measures, however justified and motivated, would initially be nothing more than a self-confident and unequivocal state privilege for Christianity, and Judaism, incidentally, over Islam. In other words, an unequal treatment of religions that simply does not allow Islamic patriarchy, contempt for humanity and hostility to life to be seen as an expression of religiousness that could benefit from religious freedom. Objectively, such measures would be a defense of the West and its achievements, which at least hints at a defense of the West. The decision of the Bavarian State Cabinet, according to which a cross must hang in every authority of the federal state from June 2018, was justified by the fact that this is to express the historical and cultural character of Bavaria and be a visible commitment to the fundamental values of the legal and social order. In view of certain formulations, one can of course smile at Bavarian local patriotism, and of course the affirmative reference to home, without which Islam-critical advances from the conservative camp generally rarely get by, is worthy of criticism. However, it is not the task of criticism to nitpick and carp at a basically reasonable view of things, which the left-wing establishment anyway and as expected covers with malice. For example, Soter was not just a sitting duck for the left-wing individualistic hedonistic vulgar atheism. Even from the other side, i.e. the decidedly Christian side, He was accused by liberals such as Lindner and church representatives such as Cardinal Marx of profaning the Christian cross. When Cardinal Marx goes so far as to claim that Soter's decree and not Islam, which the decree is a reaction to, has caused division, unrest, and conflict, it only shows how much even the Catholic Church, despite all the warnings about the politicization of religion, and in a betrayal of itself, has already become a constructive part of the political leftist cartel. A majority of the German population, according to an Emnet survey, is united in its rejection of the cross. They are united in their suppression of both the profane and the sacred dimensions of the cross and the civil legal order. There may once have been reasonable objections to the concept of the Christian-Jewish West. On the one hand, Christian-Jewish implies a historical harmony that the history of Christian anti-Judaism eschews, which is why clever polemicists still like to point out that the hyphen should really be read as a minus sign, i.e. Christian minus Jewish. On the other hand, the term Occident does not adequately reflect the secularization that characterizes bourgeois society, and Christian dominance cannot be a source of identity for secular citizens and Christmas tree Christians. In contrast, the term West had the advantage of emphasizing liberalism and the American pursuit of individual happiness, thus also conveying the objection to antisemitism and religious and other forms of collectivism, which is why it also enjoyed some popularity among critics of ideology. In the meantime, however, the West has become a cipher for what post-bourgeois society imagines to be its most progressive and liberal, and where it also believes it is drawing the right lessons from Auschwitz: anti-racism and religious freedom. This leads to the paradoxical situation that the anti-bourgeois Islamization of Western European societies is taking place under the guise of defending bourgeois values, which is why even where this development is not welcomed but rejected, a kind of paralyzed fatalism prevails. This is expressed in self-torturing phrases, such as the one that asks what sense a consequent fight against Islam would make if it meant curtailing civil rights, thus depriving oneself of one's own Western and liberal identity. In reality, there is nothing contradictory in the relationship between practical criticism of Islam and consequent defense of the bourgeoisie, both historically and logically, if one were finally, again, to become aware of the decidedly Western character of the bourgeoisie. Today, Marxist ideological criticism therefore has the task of helping the conservative challenge to Islam, whose representatives, unlike those of the left, prove to be fundamentally responsive, to get going. In Soter's speech about the fundamental values of the legal and social order, symbolized by the cross, there is only a faint echo of what the post-war conservatism of the Western world had a comparatively clear idea of at the time. Theodore Heuss, for example, declared in 1950, "There are three hills from which the West has taken its starting point: Golgotha, the Acropolis in Athens, the capital in Rome. The West has been spiritually influenced by all of them, and all three must be seen as a unity." End of quote. Soter could also have referred much more recently to Pope Benedict XVI's address to the German Bundestag on September 22, 2011. Ratzinger said, "The culture of Europe has emerged from the encounter between Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, from the encounter between the faith of Israel, the philosophical reason of the Greeks, and the legal thinking of Rome. This threefold encounter forms the inner identity of Europe." End of quote. Every myth involves transfiguration and idealization, which requires self-enlightenment. In this case, however, it seems that the connection between citizenship and Judaism or Christianity is much more compelling in real history and in terms of concepts than most conservatives and self-proclaimed Christians were ever aware of. There is, in fact, something like a transhistorical cultural dispositive of the Occident, whose concrete determinations, especially in contrast to the Islamic Orient, are clearly evident. This applies above all, both in itself and in mutual interconnection, to the sphere of law and the sphere of regulating drives as a civilizing debrutalization of gender relations. In short, the Sharia knows neither the ideal of legal security and a mediated monopoly on violence nor the concept of passive individual rights, which means that Islam and an emphatic concept of law are categorically mutually exclusive. In terms of sexual politics, Islam does not, as in the West, think of the Odyssey myth and the Sermon on the Mount, place the burden of male sexual denial, it does not know sublimation, on men, but on women, whose over-sexualizing desexualization results in their serving their husbands as objects of sexual gratification and being sexually invisible to all other men. Islamic hostility to the law and the sexual dispositive are concentrated in the headscarf as both a means of domination that inscribes itself in women's bodies and a double symbol. a sign of the phallocentric patriarchal gender relationship itself and the Islamizing seizure of public space, an aggressive challenge to all women who are not yet veiled and the visible establishment of counter-sovereignty. It is performatively absurd and therefore doomed to failure to educate girls and boys of both autochthonous and migrant origin to become modern citizens in a space in which the veiling of girls is tolerated. Such tolerance is not state neutrality, but its opposite, taking sides against those girls and betraying their civil rights, thus dismantling the civil society itself. From a historical perspective, the emergence of a bourgeois social sphere and the development of philosophical monism and Jewish monotheism in ancient Greece in the 5th century BC are phenomena whose simultaneous appearance is anything but contingent. There is much to suggest that the latter has its material basis in the former. The experience of the exchange of goods mediated by money, that is, the fact that all individual goods that human beings create are regulated and circulate via a principle, a single entity, whether it be gold, silver, or coins, may have suggested the question of whether, in a sense, all natural things, including human beings, can be traced back to a principle to which they owe their existence and inner coherence. In the midst of a world of polytheistic myths, Aristotle thus, purely in terms of intellectual history, suddenly and unexpectedly philosophically arrives at the one self-immovable mover of all being, and the Jews religiously arrive at the one creator God. The later Christian Trinity is not a dilution of or a violation of monotheism, but rather, precisely in its mysteriousness and mysticism, it is an adequate and plausible expression of the suspected but unrecognized Trinity in the constitution of exchange value, i.e. God. 1. Value abstraction equals Holy Spirit. 2. Sovereignty that sets the right of exchange and exercises sovereign control over the commodity equals Father. And 3. The coin itself as an abstraction that has become sensual equals incarnate Son, sensual supersensual thing. Insofar as the exchange of equivalents mediated by money, the comparison of the unequal, not only indirectly provides the experiential background for Aristotelian considerations, but as such forms the object of analysis, Aristotle reflects on the necessary legal equality of the exchangers as exchangers, that is, an equality that, while disregarding the social rank of the persons, remains limited to the act of exchange itself. In contrast, Judaism develops an idea that transcends the immediate reality of exchange of equivalents. Just as money as a commodity or coin, in foreign trade basically represents a universal principle of international understanding. In contrast to wars of conquest, the Jewish monotheistic God no longer functions as the particular tribal God of the Jews, but as the God of all people, before whom and whose law all people are in principle equal. This is equivalent to the idea of an undivided humanity and the fact that every individual is made in the image of God, which is why their lives are sacred. Thus, law, covenant, contract, conveyed through the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt, always also refer to a fundamental objection to the institution of slavery, indeed to the rule of man over man in general. Regardless of the specific content of Jewish law, which in important respects anticipates the later bourgeois legal principles of modernity, the relationship to sovereignty, law, and order is embedded in a messianic theory, which makes it both affirmative and critical at the same time. On the one hand, the law as such and in its content is an expression of the unreconciled state of humanity with itself, God, and nature, and, as a kind of compromise, guarantees the best possible life in the face of this general unreconciledness. In the reconciled state, on the other hand, the law would be superfluous or annulled as an external and literal expression of the spirit of the people. Incidentally, this is the model that Marx uses to think about the transitional society between capitalism and communism that is to be created through a revolutionary act, in which, under new ownership conditions, i.e. on the basis of socialized means of production, the bourgeois legal form initially continues to exist just as the products are distributed by means of labor money, which is similar to money, until the legal, commodity, and monetary forms have become completely superfluous. While early Christianity, with the first appearance of Jesus, considered the Messianic era to have arrived and therefore proselytized pagans and had softened the Jewish law in its sacramental unity because it had already been declared to be realized, the later, socially victorious Christianity, in the face of the delay of the parousia and the world not yet fully redeemed, had no choice but to re-establish the law in the form of canon law, which, historically mediated, now represents a syncretism of Jewish and Republican Roman law. From a purely theological point of view, waiting for the second coming of the Messiah instead of the first, as the religious original does, may foster an inferiority complex towards the original religion, which then translates into anti-Jewish resentment, and thus to weaken the significance of the death on the cross, even to the point of profanizing it in the name of legal necessity. In terms of the history of humanity, however, it is this theological construction that compensates for the error of expecting salvation to come soon, with which Christianity first Judaized the Greek and Roman pagans, then the European barbarians, that is, civilized them, from which a Christian self-confidence vis-a-vis the Jews could have been drawn that would have made it possible to free them from resentment. It will then be part of the irony of the later bourgeois revolutions that they were set in motion against religion, the Catholic Church, the clergy as allies of the nobility, and appear as secularization, while in fact they only enthroned the canon law of the Church, which had been developed and practiced in the shadow of the secular European pagan customary law as secular civil law. The equality of all citizens before the law, the replacement of corporal punishment based on the ius talionis with punishment in the sense of the equivalence principle, the separation of powers inspired by the doctrine of the Trinity, mitigation of punishment based on confession, i.e. confession and repentance, etc. If Islam is to be criticized, and not Islamism, then please do so in the spirit of Karl Marx's materialist critique of religion, as the left regularly demands, whereby the reference is systematically reduced to crude atheism. In one of his best texts on the Jewish question, Marx, on the other hand, distinguishes between political and human emancipation. In response to Bruno Bauer, who argued that Jews had to emancipate themselves from Judaism in order to become full citizens, Marx defined political emancipation as the emancipation of the state from religion, which meant the abolition of Christianity as the state religion and the degradation of every religion to the private quirk of the individual citizen, whereby Judaism and Christianity became indifferent to the bourgeois state in more than one sense of the word. The liberation of the individual from religion as a private quirk or of society from Judaism, a turn of phrase that is often misinterpreted as anti-Semitism, is only a matter of human emancipation. In this context, however, it should be made clear that the much-quoted passage from the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, according to which criticism of religion is the prerequisite for all criticism, i.e. that one has to work one's way from criticism of religion to criticism of law, state, and capital, applies at best to political emancipation. For human emancipation, the opposite is true, because religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the consolation of hopeless conditions, the illusion of circumstances that require illusion. The critique of religion as a practical critique of capital aims to create a reality that no longer oppresses the creature, and thus eliminates sighing from the world. An atheistic critique of religion, on the other hand, which tears religion to pieces as a flower on a chain, so that man can endure his enslavement without illusions, is, according to Marx, contempt for humanity, which has nothing to do with emancipation. Adorno also thinks in an orthodox Marxist way when he, in a sense, establishes a messianic materialism in his negative dialectics. Materialism agrees with theology where it is most materialistic. Its longing would be the resurrection of the flesh. The vanishing point of historical materialism would be its own annulment, the liberation of the spirit from the primacy of material needs in the state of their fulfillment. Only when the bodily urge is satisfied would the spirit be reconciled, and would it fulfill what it has only promised for so long, as it refuses to satisfy material needs under the spell of material conditions. End of quote. Ideology critique, whose vanishing point is always communism, even and precisely when it is not proclaimed in the face of distorted practice, is thus a translation, if you will, a secularizing translation of Jewish Christian messianism. Thus a procedure that could hardly be more Western in its substance. Marx at the time brought the USA into play as the country that had most successfully realized the political emancipation of the state from religion. In this context, it would be worth taking a closer look at the American Declaration of Independence, because its preamble, and this is not a contradiction, contains an explicit theological reference that is also doubly constitutive. Firstly, and in a general sense, for the self-understanding of civil law in general, and secondly, in a specific sense, for the attempt to legitimize the breach of the law by political resistance against the motherland with the law of the motherland, a law, however, before which the positive law and its interpretation in both nations must justify itself. The decisive first sentences of the founding document of the USA, written mainly by Jefferson, dated July 4, 1776, go as follows. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such a manner, as to them shall seem most likely to secure their safety and happiness. End of quote. The level of self-reflection in these statements is remarkable. The following points should be emphasized. Firstly, there are such things as inalienable, positive fundamental rights that all people, as individuals equal in this respect, are entitled to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These rights come from God. Secondly, since God himself does not provide the earthly insurance of these rights, secular, i.e. state power, is required to enforce them, which points to the paradox or the friendly illusion of the human rights that were declared later in history, problematized by Marx in The Jewish Question, and later by Hannah Arendt. Namely, that the fundamental rights, on the one hand, go beyond mere civil rights in the sense that they are supposed to apply to all people regardless of their nationality, but, on the other hand, are practically worthless if there is no sovereign who declares itself to be responsible, from which it follows that those who have civil rights do not need human rights. Thirdly, while secular power should derive its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, the right of resistance has nothing to do with a formally contrary majority will or voluntarism at all, because a resistant popular will is only then legally compliant when the government systematically violates inalienable fundamental rights. This is what legally excludes content-indifferent majority dictatorships against minorities and sets itself apart from any formalistic democracy and electoral law drivel. Fourthly, the idea that positive law itself could be or should be founded in a higher law that transcends both itself and human arbitrariness is quite old and was discussed under the term natural law. However, since social rights can hardly be derived from nature as such, the theological interpretation refers to God, who after all also created nature itself. One could of course say that, by means of this construction, citizens are using God and increasingly secularizing him as a placeholder and guarantor of civic reason. On the other hand, the Judeo-Christian God has always been potentially just that. The civilizing of humanity, however imperfect and fragile, is therefore also its Judaization or Christianization. That if the development of canonical canon law, to put it in a nutshell, reveals a historical dialectic of Catholicism, Judaism, and Greco-Roman antiquity, then the legal philosophical reflections of modern constitutional states arise from the complicated relationship between Catholicism and Protestantism. As a persecuted minority, Protestants seeking protection from Catholic persecution were, on the one hand, fundamentally willing to submit to the secular law of their protecting princes, which required them to further underpin theologically the separation of secular politics and religion that had always existed in Christianity. On the other hand, sects that break away from established institutions often tend to have comparatively democratic internal structures, so that Protestant groups in particular, if they were among the first to establish political communities, as in the USA, transferred their quasi-internal bourgeoisie to politics. A connection, therefore, that goes beyond the fact that the authors of the American Declaration of Independence were devout Protestants, as well as the compatibility of Protestant beliefs and capitalist imperatives, keyword, work ethic, identified by Weber. That is why the special, positive civil right of religious freedom, together with the idea of religious tolerance associated with it, is genuinely Protestant. In its historical and political origins, it was a right of protection from the Catholic Church, and tolerance was first and foremost a right granted to competing Protestant sects. Even though religious freedom became more and more generalized in the course of civil development, the concept of religion itself, that is, what was understood by religion, always had a Protestant coloring, religion as primarily faith and inner attitude, which is not essentially expressed in external actions that could collide with civil law. And even in the case of ritual and ceremonial religions such as Catholicism and Judaism, it could be assumed that practices such as confession or the observance of dietary laws did not represent a challenge to secular civil sovereignty. This means that private freedom of belief, public freedom of confession, and private and public freedom of religious practice are comparatively unproblematic in a process that, despite all the contradictions and social struggles, can be described as the bourgeoisification of religion or the Christianization/Judaization of society. That is why there has never been a specifically religiously motivated contempt for Jewish Christian women that was to be enforced in the name of religious freedom against civil society. In relevant areas, the old church was no more patriarchal than society as a whole, and the later overcoming of patriarchy ultimately also encompassed the Western religions, more or less sluggishly and with friction. It is therefore more than strange that the members of the left-wing cartel, where they do not justify it in an anti-racist way, encounter Islamic patriarchy, which overshadows the old Western patriarchy, with the Western concepts and ideas of religious freedom, secularism, and laicism, and that the only socially perceptible civil resistance to the obvious Islamization is formulated from the right, just as the best speeches against anti-Semitism and Islam and for Israel in the German Bundestag are held by representatives of the AfD. This, together with Trump's electoral success and policies, is driving the left among Israel's friends into a homemade identity crisis, the main symptoms of which are their hysterical engagement against right-wing populism and the denunciatory labeling of an unwavering Marxist, Freudian, and Adorno-inspired critique of ideology as right-wing anti-German. In the face of this madness, it must be emphasized that without a decidedly positive reference to the Judeo-Christian connotations of the Occident, no concept of bourgeoisie can be opposed to the self-destructive tendencies of post-bourgeois society, let alone anything remotely resembling a rational communist idea. If the lesson to be learned from the National Socialist orientalization of the Occident, according to the political class, is to promote its repetition under the banner of Islam, then it is high time to wage the crusade that was missed in 1933. Critical thinking that does not stop even in the face of progress, wrote Horkheimer and Adorno in 1969 in the new edition of the Dialectic of Enlightenment, demands a commitment to the remnants of freedom, to tendencies towards real humanity, even if they seem powerless in the face of the great historical train. This sentence undoubtedly formulates a program that every present must reinterpret for itself if it wants to do justice to it in keeping with the times. Horkheimer and Adorno's today has long since become a thing of the past. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the political division of the world into oversized blocks that are objectively forced to collide is no longer presented as a confrontation between capitalism and real socialism, but between the West and the Orient. The conflicts in the Third World and the renewed growth of totalitarianism, mentioned by Horkheimer and Adorno, had already intensified in the shadow of the Second World War and the system confrontation into that anti-colonialist Islamic revival movement that is currently covering the earth with its suicide and virtue terror. As right as it is to understand Islamism as a modern anti-modern reaction to the crisis of the capital relationship, so little can the sole recourse to the processing value illuminate the concrete form of Islamic hatred of civilization and the Jews. It is not possible to determine what distinguishes the Islamist suicide bomber from the Japanese kamikaze pilot, the Muslim terrorist from the puritanical moral guardian a la Oliver Cromwell, by exclusively referring to the chapter on fetishism in Marx's Capital. For Horkheimer and Adorno, it was a matter of course to reflect on the National Socialist transformation of the false whole into the whole evil of Auschwitz in the context of Western history from the ancient Greeks to the present day. The stage on which they traced the historical philosophical drama of the dialectic of enlightenment, of nature and the mastery of nature, that is, of instinct, law, sacrifice, and individuation, was in the West. In view of the fact that the headquarters of the barbaric revival movement, of which National Socialism was the prototype, has shifted eastwards since the end of the Second World War, we should broaden our view to include the drama of the history of civilization in the Orient, which has been directed by Islam since the 7th century. In this context, the Oriental dialectic of the Enlightenment will not reveal its specific nature only in the confrontation with bourgeois society, but already in Christianity, which Horkheimer only rediscovered for himself on a large scale in his later writings. The proposed update of the critical program, the attempt to write a dialectic of enlightenment for the Orient and to relate it to that of the Occident, can, since it is only at the beginning, only be outlined in the following on the basis of selected examples. In doing so, it will be attempted to show, among other things, that the claim, which has been propagated by postmodernists and postcolonialists since the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism 1979, at the latest, that the Occident has always constituted itself in demarcation from the Orient as its very other, is quite true against its anti-Western intention. At the same time, it would be directed against the betrayal of critical thinking by the so-called undogmatic left. Thus, in Phase 2 in Jungle World, self-proclaimed anti-sexists, some of whom no longer know the difference between Leviathan and Behemoth, between bikini and burqa, discuss in earnest to what extent criticism of Islam and the defense of civil rights is an instrumentalization of feminism for a racist and sexist peace with German conditions, and to what extent, on the other hand, the Islamic patriarchy should be protected. And here, the most delicate criticism of Islam, for example in concrete, now seems to be allowed only if it is doubly flanked. Firstly, by inflating and rejecting the socially completely irrelevant misappropriation of Islam criticism for ordinary xenophobia, and secondly, by attacking Christianity. At concrete, this is mainly the responsibility of K. Sokolowski, since the original Nazis, such as those in the NPD, tend to attract attention more through Islamophilia than their historical predecessors. The right-wing foreigners' out hatred of Muslims, which incidentally usually has little to say against Islam in the Orient, can at most be used as a milieu. If we take the activists of pro-NRW, pro-Coln, politically incorrect, and the civil rights movement Pax Europa, together with their respective supporters, and summarize them, however permissible this may be, we find that they reach an average of less than 5% of the electorate in elections and can only bring a few hundred people onto the streets for national and international mobilizations. In order to be able to bluster about an Islamophobic and racist danger in a somewhat consistent manner, given this negligible influence on the events of the Republic, the demagogic denouncer Sokolowski simply assigns Islam-critical and liberal authors, such as the German Turks Kalek and Atesh and the Jewish Germans Broder and Giordano, to this right-wing camp. He cannot be blamed for the fact that traditional anti-racism, including anti-sexism, is obviously overwhelmed by the predominantly East German no-go areas for foreigners, the conditions in deportation prisons, and, to some extent, by the foreigners' authorities. However, he can be blamed for constructing an opponent in the form of Islamophobia for compensatory reasons, which, because it does not exist or only exists to a marginal extent, at least seems to be conquerable. Because the alliance of leftists, citizens, and Sharia Muslims that is forming against it is always more threatening than the few right-wing Islam critics. With a delay of 2 to 4 centuries, the birth of the New Orient took place in the form of a poor copy of the Constitution of Europe. In both cases, the barbarians of the hinterland, i.e. the Germanic tribes, Goths, etc. here, Arabs there, militarily defeated the respective advanced civilization of the Old World, i.e. Rome here, Persia there, with monotheism, i.e. Christianity here, Islam there, emerging as the central ideology of society. However, the sequence of events in this process already revealed a striking and momentous difference. In Europe, the Romans had long since voluntarily converted to Christianity when Rome succumbed to the invading barbarians, who then, fascinated by the cultural heights of the defeated civilization, also voluntarily converted. War and violence in the name of Christian mission subsequently remained episodic and regionally limited practices that were always theologically controversial as deviations from the Christian ideal. They therefore never attained the systematic status of dogmas. In the Orient, on the other hand, the Arab barbarians were the first to be Islamized, and then organized their conquests as civilized Muslims in order to murder or Islamize the conquered polytheists and subjugate the people of the book. In this process, Islam critics and apologists agree that the simple and tautological monotheism of Muhammad served as an ideological bond that fused the Arabs, who had previously practiced competing tribal polytheisms and waged war against each other, into a community of believers in one God. The religious war against non-Muslims also channeled the traditional anarchistic economy of robbery and war outwards, thus creating the possibility of internal peace. This peace could also be guaranteed by replacing the customary Arab law, such as blood revenge, with the Sharia. Alongside the adoption of slavery, the introduction of patriarchy and dhimmitud, jihad was thus a central subject of Islamic jurisprudence and eschatology from the outset. Not only the Islamic combination of war and salvation, that is, the shariation of the world as a prerequisite for the last day, is a new concept that is still completely foreign to Judaism and Christianity. In Islam, the Shaheed replaces the Jewish Christian martyr, who passively endures persecution, torture, and death in steadfastness for his God, and whose self-sacrifice is a vicarious atonement for the sins of his own collective. The Shaheed sacrifices himself in active combat against foreign collectives for privileged and immediate access to paradise, without having to take the detour via the grave penalty, the primitive variant of purgatory. When Horkheimer and Adorno write about the Counter-Reformation and Reformation, Horkheimer/Adorno 1995, the horrors of fire and sword were not committed as an exaggeration but as the realization of the principle of faith itself, then this is at most a polemical exaggeration, whereas it applies completely to Islam. Hitler recognized this difference. If Charles Martel had not won at Poitiers, if we had already taken on the Jewish world, Christianity is so boring, we would have taken over much sooner, even Islam, this doctrine of the reward of heroism. The fighter alone has the seventh heaven. The Germans would have conquered the world with it. Only Christianity has kept us from it. End of quote. For Heidegger's philosophy, whose deified actual being toward death incorporates the German soldier's experience on the front line in the First World War, the idea of reward is too primitive, because an egoistically motivated sacrifice is of no value to it. For Heidegger, the actual and true self-sacrifice consists, on the other hand, in being absolutely devoted and purposeless. In the epilogue to Was ist Metaphysik? What is metaphysics? Heidegger writes, the addiction to purpose confuses the clarity of the fear-filled awe of sacrificial courage. While Winston Churchill still described Hitler's Mein Kampf as a new Quran of faith and war, bombastic, long-winded, formless, but pregnant with its message, Heidegger's Being and Time and its subsequent writings would be more like a Quran for intellectuals. While Jews and Christians harbor allegorical fantasies of paradise itself or the earth after the Last Judgment, according to which people who overcome death will live in harmony with God and all creatures at a higher level than before the fall, salvation in Islam means something different. The expulsion of the spirit from a land of milk and honey characterized by unrestrained and unbridled penetration of virgins. Liberated from all earthly social and ritual regulations of coitus, wine and sperm are to flow in torrents instead of milk and honey. In Islamic eschatology, nothing remains of the Jewish messianism that Christianity still preserved in the paradoxical form of a Messiah who has already come and is again expected. The protest against earthly misery, against the false organization of the world, which Marx carelessly attributed to religion per se, and whose secularization justified his categorical imperative as a consequence of his critique of religion, was completely replaced in Islam, whose God explicitly expresses his pleasure in blood, by the doubling of earthly misfortune. If the transition from a nomadic to a settled life, from common property to individual property, takes place while maintaining androcratic continuity, then property must not only be protected from theft, but its male line of inheritance must also be guaranteed. In historical perspective, this necessarily led to the destruction of matriarchal forms of socialization through the establishment of patriarchy, which essentially obliged women to monogamy and chastity. This was accompanied by the legalization of sexual relations within marriage and the demonization of extramarital sex. However, Islamic patriarchy, especially compared to the Western model, which has been overcome by bourgeois society, exhibits numerous peculiarities that can be traced back to a purely phallocentric solution to the dichotomy of sexual gratification within marriage and sexual abstinence outside of it. The socially required regulation of sexual desire is declared to be more or less the sole responsibility of women, under the primacy of male potency. In Islam, coitus within marriage is not only legal, but maximizing it is a religious duty for two reasons. Firstly, reproduction and with it male potency and female fertility are stylized politically and eschatologically as a birth jihad. For Muhammad al-Ghazali, the most important theologian of Islam, the great jihad, that is, enduring with women and children, is just as meritorious as the small jihad, that is, fighting in the holy war, not least because the great zeal provides the necessary human material for the small one, marry and multiply. He quotes from the Sunnah in his book on marriage, "For on the day of judgment I will make a show of you before the other nations, even with the premature birth." Accordingly, the Muslim is credited with the reward of a son who fights and dies for the holy cause, for sexual intercourse with his wife. Secondly, Islamic theology understands coitus within marriage as one of two decisive contributions to the renunciation of extramarital sex. Since men are assumed to have a stronger desire than women, the duty of copulation is primarily the disposal of the erection by the woman, that is, female sexual service. In this way, a wife can only apply for a divorce with a chance of success if she is able to prove in public that her husband mistreats her, satisfies her less than once every 4 months, proves to be impotent or infertile, or stops providing her with maintenance. Her husband, on the other hand, can repudiate her at any time and without any red tape as soon as she refuses to obey him, for example by refusing to consent to sexual intercourse. Every marriage contract in accordance with Sharia law therefore centrally seals the exchange of male maintenance obligation for female obedience with the bride price. In order not to overtax the individual Muslim woman with the dampening of her husband's sensuality and as a seedbed, and to compensate for the potential shortage of men in a warlike society, Islam combined female monogamy with male polygamy from the outset, with the man's privilege to the expensive conventional marriage of convenience and the cheap marriage of pleasure or temporary marriage. The second decisive contribution to the renunciation of extramarital sex is not satisfied with the taboo on adultery typical of patriarchy, punishment, public stoning. Nor is it satisfied with the additional criminalization of sexual intercourse between unmarried persons, punishment, public flogging, which makes the unconditional preservation of female virginity until the first marriage the central Islamic commandment. Rather, any situation that could lead to adultery and fornication, even the mere social encounter between unmarried and related men and women, is to be excluded. Thus, the gender apartheid that arises from such rigid consequentialism materializes in a virgin and chastity cage that is erected around the demonized women, because otherwise, qua their pure femininity, they would cause unrest, seduce to zina, and thus plunge the ummah back into pre-Islamic chaos. Apart from the mutilation of the vagina, the role of menstruation in marriage and penetration law, and the identification of the hymen and family honor, which transform the vagina into a battlefield for the great and small jihad, religious zeal for virtue is institutionalized in the domestic isolation and public veiling of women, as well as in their chastisement. As is well known, this can lead to honor killings in the event of insubordination. The same drive that the Muslim woman has to satisfy permanently in private, even on the back of a camel, sunnah, according to Al-Ghazali, must not be awakened in public, that is, with foreign men, by desexualizing her own body. Even before prayer and other religious rituals, the Muslim woman therefore ennobles her character in the great jihad against the ego, Ibn Juzay, by being a willing, submissive, grateful, serving, and obedient sunmaker to her own husband, who otherwise behaves chastely. Conversely, the man's self-effacement consists of the discharge of his sexual urges, including rape, for the purpose of producing offspring, the suppression of sensuality and relaxation for the ritual, and the selfless material maintenance, education, and punishment of his relatives in order to save them and himself from hell. While the Christian paternalistic patriarchy recognizes women as persons to a certain extent and provides them with material security, for example, through the taboo of divorce, male monogamy, virilocality, the ideal of love, and the reduction of sexuality to reproduction. And while the right of female self-determination is already enshrined in the bourgeois marriage contract of Kant, the Oriental patriarchy completely subjugates women to a sexist triad of money, violence, and coitus. The term pig has always been used as a derogatory term for people whose sexuality deviates from the social norm, which therefore appears to be animalistic, natural, and inhibited. This attribution may have been made, as Horkheimer and Adorno suggest, on the one hand because of certain similarities between humans and pigs in terms of anatomy and the taste of the meat, and on the other hand because of the sense of smell which is still dominant in pigs and has been gradually suppressed and repressed in humans. The happiness of this sense, which is closest to the memory of the past, as it is to the gender, is distorted in the image of the pig, however, to unfree sniffing on all fours. In Homer's Odyssey, Kirk punishes the civilized men who fall for her by turning them into pigs. In contrast, Odysseus' self-control, as the suppression of the drive that makes him into a self and separates him from the animal, is paradoxically rewarded with what the uninhibited desire in vain and for which they are punished, sexual intercourse with Kirk, which is similar to their subjugation. In this way, the myth conceives of mastery over oneself, that is, the taming of one's inner nature through reason, as a prerequisite for mastery over external nature, and the women identified with it as a riddle of irresistibility. The same applies to Odysseus' struggle with the sirens. Horkheimer and Adorno, however, emphasize the resistance to or outwitting of fate as a condition of individuation. Furthermore, it remains unclear whether Odysseus, who is tied to the mast while his crew rows with their ears plugged, is more likely to renounce or to sublimate when he is prepared in this way to surrender to the song of the sirens, that is, to let himself be captivated by it, without at the same time giving himself away and unleashing himself. What remains, however, is the longing of the one who passes by. Islam, on the other hand, circumvents such individualization dilemmas and kills desire by silencing and shackling the sirens, that is, women. Thus, even the post-colonial thinker Frantz Fanon, who affirms veiling as a weapon in the fight against the voyeuristic gazes projected onto the colonizers, describes it as a traditional shackle. When the Prophet asked Fatima what was best for a woman, she replied, that she does not see a man and is not seen by one. An answer that delighted Muhammad. That is how I recognize my daughter. Sunnah, According to Al-Ghazali, finally, under Islam, a man is still allowed to remain a pig or a billy goat, even where he is required to renounce his urges. With the veil and the demand to lower one's gaze and not to send any acoustic signals, in other words to be silent and to refrain from clicking heels, the Muslim woman is made invisible, inaudible, and blind to others at the same time, so that desire may not even arise, wherever the unleashed gazes of Muslim men may roam. This brutalization of gender relations and sexuality dehumanizes the Sharia-compliant Muslim woman, turning her into a ghost and a factory for sons. However, by elevating her to the role of guardian of public order within and producer of jihadists without, she is able to eroticize her own subjugation, that is, to desire the headscarf or sun as her phallus beyond all measure. Self-confident and educated women who wear headscarves are therefore not speaking in favor of the harmlessness of the headscarf or against phallocentric oppression, but for the loss of precisely that self whose existence is all the more fervently emphasized. In contrast, the destructive tendency of the progress of male self-mutilation in the West is to establish the rule of men over men, especially of men over women, and to overcome or break nature by means of self-aggrandizing renunciation instead of reconciling it. This is most clearly expressed in the castration of the early Church Fathers, who took the Sermon on the Mount a little too literally. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Matthew 5 verses 27 to 30. But Western progress itself, precisely in contrast to the Islamic Orient, is also clearly evident here, namely the dehumanization and humanization of gender relations and sexuality, as the unclothing of the Western female body deplored by post-feminists e.g. Christina von Braun and Bettina Mathis, is also inconceivable without the disciplining of the male gaze and drive. Odysseus confronts the inevitability of fate by means of his self-assertion. He is neither enslaved to Kirk nor to the sirens. This is the initiation of individuation and Western civilization, with which Horkheimer and Adorno sympathize, despite all the sadness about the price that had to be paid for it. In stark contrast to this is Heidegger's actual existence for regression, which only becomes real as soon as it is completely listening to fate as an authoritarian community of people and destiny, too. What emerges in the Odyssey and the Sermon on the Mount is what, according to Norbert Elias, is decisive for Western development. That the centralization of political power in the public sphere corresponds to a centralizing control of effect, the formation of the superego within the individual. The rhetorical question posed by the Cologne cabaret artist Jürgen Becker as to why Muslim men do not wrap the women's headscarf around their eyes to protect themselves from female charms, therefore, encapsulates the fundamental and momentous difference between Oriental and Occidental drive regulation in all its simplicity and banality. Even before any substantive definition, the Sharia differs from civil law, which is firmly anchored in the traditions of the West, in three essential prerequisites that, remarkably, hardly play a role in public discussions. Firstly, contrary to the legal principle of the abstract equality of all citizens before the law, both the legal expression of the Judeo-Christian equality of all people before God and the repressive egalitarianism of the commodity society, which must abstract from the particular in order to make it comparable, Sharia law requires that the same be treated equally and the unequal be treated unequally. The Central Council of Muslims and legally trained converts such as Murat Hoffman repeatedly refer to this principle with some pride, as if it were an objection on behalf of the concrete and unmistakable individual against his or her being made into a general, and not merely the legitimization of the unequal treatment of groups of people by the ruling class, of men and women, patriarchy, believers and non-believers, dhimmitud, slavery, and jihad. In this sense, the concept of passive individual rights is completely foreign to Sharia law. Instead, it merely claims to categorize all conceivable human actions in the political, civil, and ritual conduct of life as either obligatory, recommended, forbidden, frowned upon, or permitted. Rights are therefore always and automatically identical with the obligatory actions of others, such as the right of a husband to female obedience or a wife to male maintenance. That is why Islam cannot recognize the individual right to physical integrity, for example. On the contrary, it punishes the slightest offense with those barbaric corporal punishments that the Western public seems willing to recognize as typical of Sharia law. For example, chopping off hands for theft, flogging or stoning for drinking alcohol, fornication, and adultery. However, it is not just archaic sadism that is vented on the torturable Leib, Bertolt Brecht, on the creatureliness of the delinquent. There are explicit precautions to avoid excesses and excesses. Rather, public punishment is understood as a ritual cleansing of the best collective on earth. As the crowd participates in the repayment of forbidden lust in the coin of pain, Farida Cashbom, blow for blow and throw for throw, in the case of stoning, actually, in the case of flogging, mimetically, all those involved cleanse themselves of the guilty and impure, split off and projected onto the delinquent's parts of their own self. Furthermore, the third characteristic of Sharia law, the obstruction of justice, stands between the fantasy of punishment and its actual execution. Thus, the conviction of capital crimes requires a confession from the sinner, which must be repeated 4 times, or 4 male witnesses to the offense. Even an unproven accusation, i.e., not one that has been proven to be false, is considered defamation, which in turn is declared a capital offense. Any witnesses who dare to testify to less than 4 would therefore be guilty even without a trial. At the same time, the Oriental God advises against confession. Quote, "Everyone in my community, Ummah, can count on the forgiveness of their sins, with the exception of those who confess their sins, Sunnah. He seeks to silence or pressure any witnesses by means of eschatology. Whoever covers the sins of his neighbor in this world, God will cover his sins on Judgment Day. Sunnah, or those who wish that something abominable that is said about the faithful should become generally known, can expect a painful punishment, both in this world and in the hereafter, Quran 2400 hours 19. Both Islam-critical Sharia experts such as Christine Schirmacher and Islam apologists such as George Clauda, who goes by the name of Lysis on the internet, want to see humanity guaranteed by the Sharia's renunciation of expansive criminal prosecution. One interprets the elasticity of criminal law as an attempt to mitigate or circumvent the draconian punishments, while the other interprets the self-restraint of the monopoly on violence as a gain in freedom for individuals in the private and hidden sphere, over which Allah imposes his protective veil, Sunnah. Both fail to recognize that this practice fully exposes the barbaric and despotic character of the Sharia. The punishment of the Sharia contradicts the concept, the idea, the form of law and justice per se, because it shifts its goal and loses its predictability. It does not even aim to achieve legal certainty, and thus a rational relationship between the law and those subject to it, i.e. the subjects. Ultimately, once the punishment has been carried out as an exemplary exception to uphold the threat of punishment, it no longer applies to the original offense itself, but either to the confession of this offense, which, when repeated 4 times, appears as an unabashed confession of sin and thus becomes the actual offense. Or, in the absence of a confession, it is directed against the failure to keep the sin committed secret or to cover it up, so that 4 male witnesses feel compelled to testify. In contrast to the Western legal tradition, to canon law, confession, and the Inquisition, which prepared the way for civil law, confession, and truth, have no mitigating effect in Islam. On the contrary, they are criminalized. According to an Arab proverb, 2/3 of a hidden sin is forgiven, so that the awareness of wrongdoing is no longer directed at the offense itself, but only at its discovery. Only then do the Sharia courts strike, and they do so relentlessly. The elasticity of Islamic criminal law, which fascinates Schirmacher, results from the indeterminacy of the boundary between the hidden and the public, which is constantly being shifted by the interests of day-to-day politics and the mood of the collective, and thus obeys no law except that of arbitrariness. In the private sphere protected by the Sharia, which Clauda hallucinates as a refuge of individual self-determination, the law of the strongest lurks from the outset, because the Islamic State's renunciation of the monopoly on violence is identical with its highest legal good, the self-regulating honor of the collective and Allah, in whose name the greatest atrocities that the faithful do to each other are to be covered. It may be a sin in Islam to beat or rape a woman and children half to death. However, the perpetrators, victims, and non-participating relatives have to settle such shameful matters within the family, because otherwise they would bring shame on the community of believers. In general, the relationship between Sharia and the earthly monopoly on violence, on state sovereignty, is characterized by a remarkable tension. On the one hand, the ideal of the unity of religion and state permeates the history of Islam. According to this, Muhammad's reign in Medina, which is glorified as a golden age, during which the laws of Allah ruled on earth, is to be restored. On the other hand, this ideal cannot be realized on the basis of the Sharia. Firstly, the canonical texts not only contain no concrete provisions for the legitimate succession of Muhammad, but also no indications of preferred forms of government, such as the obvious theocracy. If the Sharia demands state rule, but at the same time leaves the question of the legitimacy and institutional nature of political power unanswered, then any concrete earthly form of state and legal practice can be attacked as un-Islamic on the basis of the Quran and Sunnah. It is therefore no coincidence that anarchy, despotism, and palace revolts characterize the real history of Islamic statehood. Secondly, the Sharia still has the monopoly on violence itself, in that it declares its judicial and executive application to be the task of every single free and male Muslim. You are the best community that was created for the people. You enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and you believe in Allah. Quran 3:110, cf 7 hours 71 minutes. 9:112, 2241. Here, the population is not to exercise state power in the ideological sense of representative democracy. Here, the monopoly on violence is decentralized and multiplied against its own concept in self-administered justice. The alleged laws and rights of the Sharia, which according to the term should actually be static and should lead to legal certainty and truth, thus already exhibit the character of dynamic measures that can be adapted to the respective situation or the respective interests and moods of the collective, with a short period of validity, as Arendt, Newman, Adorno, and Horkheimer have worked out in relation to the National Socialist Unstat. The behemoth, Hobbes, which is characterized by the absence of a reliable sovereignty, does not reproduce order, but keeps the community in a state of militant movement, i.e. disorder, in order to execute the law of nature, as in Nazi Germany, the law of history, as in Stalinism, and the geopolitical mission of Allah, as in Islam. Insisting that the Arabic term Sharia should not be translated as Islamic law or Islamic legislation, as is usually the case, but instead should be understood literally as path to the watering place, is not based on pedantic philology. On the contrary, it is a matter of necessity. The telos of Islam is expressed here in no uncertain terms. To set a herd of sheep in motion, which will submit itself and the world to the Sharia with determination and resolve, so that judgment day can come, whereby the individual is always sacrificed to the collective. By contrast, Western political theorists, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, Machiavelli, Montesquieu, Hobbes, consistently regarded despotism or tyranny as a degenerate form of government, however authoritarian their respective ideal states may sometimes appear. The primary criticism of Islam that it, unlike Christianity and Judaism, did not produce a doctrine of the two powers, the secular and the divine, as a starting point for the later secular to laicist separation of state and religion, not only obscures the view of the much more relevant despotic character of Islamic law and state understanding. Rather, the actual civilizing achievement of canon law is also being suppressed from the cultural memory of the West. Until the bourgeois revolution, this consisted less in the politically necessary division of earthly jurisdiction than in the preservation and further development of Roman, and thus the preparation of bourgeois law against the pagan customary law of the Germanic, Gothic, etc. barbarians. In the pre-bourgeois Occident, the Church and its representatives, not the prince and the emperor, spoke the more progressive law. From Jesus saying, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's," Matthew 22. Via Augustine's theory of the state and the medieval two-swords theory, to Luther's two kingdoms doctrine, Christian theology reflects the real historical non-identity of ecclesiastical and secular authority. In the Talmud, diaspora Judaism subordinates religious law, Torah, to the secular law of the day. The law of the state is the law. The terms I, ego, self, and subject have been used here in a somewhat general and imprecise way. This is due to the shifts in their meaning, which cannot be broken down here in detail, depending on whether the focus is on the Islamic conditions of individuation or socialization, for the elucidation of which both psychoanalysis and the Unstat theory, cf. in particular the texts of Gerhard Scheidt from recent years, should be applied, e.g. family and education, social morality, law, or state. Thus, in contrast to pre-Islamic customary law, the Sharia creates legal subjectivity, especially for women, in that women are no longer merely objects of the law. However, it is not possible to speak of subjects in the emphatically bourgeois sense. although it is possible to assume that there is an internalized, bad conscience, which differs from the Western conscience in its collectivist despotic character. However, a real internalization of external authorities in the form of the superego does not take place, or only precariously, because libidinal ties between parents and children are not very pronounced and interpersonal obedience is not overcome. Muslims are to remain, in a sexually complementary way, either command givers or recipients or both, so that no self-responsible, autonomous individuals arise. While the right-wing Atlanticists of the 1950s, Adenauer, Hughes, tried to underpin their policy of Western integration with the unfortunately forgotten Western ideology of a synthesis of the three hills of the Acropolis, equivalent to freedom, reason, Greek philosophy, the capital, equivalent to Roman law, i.e. the rule of law, and Golgotha, meaning Christianity, which means equality and compassion, the historically continuous in the Orient is rather explained by the contrast between the desert, meaning deprivation, renunciation, meagerness, suffering, life in this world, and the oasis, meaning fulfillment, breaking the fast, discharge of instincts, life in the next world. It is in the spirit and letter of the Sharia that the cost-effective self-administered justice as a means of preserving collective honor is given precedence over state intervention. Thus, the murderers of apostates or adulteresses have been and continue to be acquitted or only mildly punished by the official courts of the Islamic world. And so, as is typical of patriarchal systems, the male heads of families continue to act as the legislature, judiciary, executive, and social welfare state in one person. Unlike the Sharia courts, which may strike arbitrarily but are at least bound by confessions or witnesses, the virtue terrorists are satisfied with rumors, because whether true or false, they already tarnish the family's reputation. God loves jealousy based on a moment of suspicion. Al-Ghazali passes on the tradition. If, for example, the woman killed in honor turns out to be innocent, then that is no reason for the murderers to feel remorse or shame. Their victim should not have behaved in a way that gave rise to rumors. The consequences of this sense of injustice for the individuation and subject formation of those subjected to it should not be underestimated. Even the most authoritarian state relies on the fear of its subjects, because the causal relationship between disobedience and state consequences remains stable, and thus rationally calculable. Adapting to the most rigid sexual morals, for example, at least guarantees survival. In contrast, the instability of the despotic chaotic state of measures destroys any possibility of rationality in anticipatory obedience and thus creates indefinite fear in the subjects. Since the reality of all actions has to be subordinated to public appearances, not only lies and dissimulation become the moral virtues of a socialization under Islam. Moral subjectivity as such becomes precarious. Unlike the bad conscience of the Western subject, which, like the Christian and Jewish God, whose internalization it is, sees and judges everything, even the hidden, and thus serves exclusively as a guide to one's own actions in albeit conditional rational form, the bad conscience of the Islamic subject is necessarily directed at something that, as it were, categorically eludes its rational control. The rumor about one's own actions and the activities of those who affect the group's honor. The internalized collectivist code of honor is thus not aimed at subjects who align their actual actions with a sense of right and wrong and take individual responsibility for them. On the contrary, the law of good reputation requires the individual to take responsibility for the public perception of the actions of others, whereby such appearances, even concerning one's own actions, can only be individually accounted for to a limited extent. On this basis, moral objects rather than subjects inevitably arise, who, whether perpetrators or victims of the terror of virtue, always believe themselves to be driven by circumstances. Thus, honor killers in Turkey, for example, are unsurprisingly called victims of fate. This despotic spirit, which permeates classical Islamic society from the arbitrary God, who is exempt from reason and thus from theodicy, to Sharia law, from forms of government to the upbringing of children, and which determines the relationship of individuals to sin and delinquency, therefore marks not a difference in morality, but rather the difference between morality and amorality. For example, Article 12 of the Islamic Human Rights Declaration of the Islamic Council for Europe of 1981 interprets the passive right to freedom of expression in the light of the Sharia as follows. Everyone can think, believe, and express what he thinks and believes without anyone else intervening or hindering him, as long as he remains within the general limits prescribed by the Sharia. It is not permissible to spread falsehood and to publish that which serves to spread immorality or weaken the Ummah. If the hypocrites and those who stir up sedition in the city do not cease, we shall certainly cause you to proceed against them, and they will then only be your neighbors in it for a short time. A curse will be upon them. Wherever they are caught, they will be seized and ruthlessly killed. With his polemics against the Western confessional animal or the hermeneutics of the self as a regime of truth, the totalizing expansion of pastoral power or the appropriation of the body by the soul, the postmodern philosopher Foucault only seemingly criticized the destructive nature of progress, that is, the renunciation and breaking of nature. For by either not taking note of the increase in legal security, in rationality in the relationship between subject and law, and in the debrutalization of sexuality and gender relations, etc., or by identifying it exclusively with the subtilization of power and domination, he also deals with the residues of freedom, the tendencies towards real humanity, individuality and reconciliation, and thus progress in the history of civilization in the West. If one is to absolve his thinking of evil intentions, then it is the abandonment of materialist dialectics propagated in the spirit of postmodernism that mediates between Foucault's initially at least anti-fascist and critical of power micropolitics of de-individualization and his later Islamophile kowtow to the authoritarian, truth, and reason-hostile collectivism of the Orient. The three intertwined imperatives of the jihad and martyrdom doctrine, the phallocentric regulation of drives in patriarchy and the despotic group honor as the vanishing point of the Sharia and morality, which all amount to forms of sacrifice of the individual for the sake of the collective, are also reflected in places where Islam is considered comparatively harmless. In the ritual, the so-called 5 pillars of Islam. As easy as it is, for example, to become a member of the Ummah, it is enough to make a declaration of faith in front of witnesses, first pillar. It is said to be impossible to leave the community of believers alive again, that is, to weaken the collective. Apostasy is punishable by death. In general, the sophisticated monotheistic rituals can be interpreted as a way of overcoming and sublimating archaic sacrificial cults, as a protest against what Nietzsche called the disgusting barbaric form of the guilt sacrifice, which is always the sacrifice of the innocent for the sins of the guilty. In the Hebrew narrative of Abraham and his son Isaac, for example, the human sacrifice of the firstborn is replaced by the animal and pars pro toto sacrifice of the foreskin. The self-sacrifice of Jesus in the New Testament abolishes animal sacrifice, indeed the practice of sacrifice itself, as is recalled, among other things, in the ritual of the Last Supper. Judaism and Christianity also internalize, individualize and rationalize the archaic renunciation of drives, of the firstborn, the first fruits of the field and one's own livestock, and the cunning that motivates it. After all, the gods are to be bribed and persuaded by means of purification rituals, dietary laws, fasting, prayer, confession, preaching, etc. Such a progression of enlightenment is not to be found in Islam, which remains stuck in its fundamentalist claim to have restored the original and authentic, i.e. pre-Jewish, Abrahamic ritual. In this sense, Oriental monotheism, unlike Judaism and Christianity, still stands in opposition to animal sacrifice. In the form of the festival of sacrifice at the end of the pilgrimage ritual, the 5th pillar, it even forms the high point of the religious calendar. Every year, hundreds of thousands of animals are slaughtered simultaneously for the millions of pilgrims in Mecca, and their blood then drenches entire streets, with which the pious smear their white garments. On the other hand, the archaic human sacrifice is neither propagated nor practiced by Islam. In the traditional jihadist who falls in the fight against the infidel, in the modern suicide bomber who celebrates the murder of Jews as a form of suicide, in the honor killer who risks his freedom to slaughter his own daughter or sister, in these practices, which are accompanied by rituals or even have ritualistic features and are eschatologically legitimized, it survives in a transformed form. As a willingness to sacrifice oneself and others for the collective, as a disregard for the life of the individual, as a longing for death. In this way, the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Bible, as retold in the Quran, contains a decisive innovation. The son, having been informed of his impending death, unlike in the Old Testament, agrees to it. Then we gave him the good news of a gentle son. When he was old enough to work with him, he said, "O my son, I see in a dream that I am slaughtering you. Now look, what do you think about it?" He said, "O my father, do as you are commanded. You shall find me, so Allah wills, among the patient." Quran 37:101f. Just as the Jew, according to the Quran, clings to life more than anyone else, so the exemplary Muslim does not cling to life at all. Islam also attaches great importance to fasting, which is the fourth religious duty of Muslims in the form of Ramadan. While Jews and Christians usually only abstain from particular pleasures in their diet and leisure activities, meat, alcohol, etc., for the duration of the fast or sometimes stop eating altogether for a relatively short period, Muslims fast by abstaining from all food and drink, smoking, sexual intercourse, and other earthly pleasures for an entire month, only during the day, and then indulging all the more from late evening onwards, until they are able to distinguish a white thread from a black one at dawn, and the rigorous abstinence begins anew. In this peculiarity of fasting, two strands are confirmed and reinforced that are relevant to the socialization of individuals under Islam as a whole. On the one hand, the despotic discretion of God, who does not want to know or even covers up what the faithful do in the secrecy of darkness. On the other hand, the disciplining technique of keeping the body of the Muslim in a constant state of extreme tension between the poles of total denial of desire, outside of marriage, and total discharge of desire in marriage, two variants of desublimation. In contrast, prayer, the second pillar of the rite, is exclusively characterized by the renunciation of desire, submission, and the shedding of the ego in the collective political struggle. In Judaism and Christianity, it is still a sigh of the oppressed creature, Karl Marx. But outside of collective festivals, it is above all a personal, individually varying dialogue between the individual and God. Islam drives out every last vestige of individuality from prayer. The individuals are merged into an egalitarian prayer mob. According to rules that are formally laid down in detail, it is performed in the same way worldwide in the mosque, even synchronously, and at the same time, which is determined by the public call of the muezzin. Jews and Christians, according to the explicit accusation of the Quran, do not even join the same direction of prayer among themselves. Quran 2:145. This 5 times a day exercise in disciplined structures and gives rhythm to everyday life and, together with the small or large washing of the believer that immediately precedes it and the ritual cleansing of clothing and prayer space, takes up almost half the day. In view of the ritual dichotomy of bodily purity and impurity, the prayer times are therefore the only periods in which the Muslim can feel comfortable in his own skin, at one with his body, the community, and God. The repetitive monotony and the dullness of the verbal content are doubled. The prayer content hardly goes beyond the assurance that God is one and the greatest, which has to be repeated countless times. Physically, the pious Muslim performs a total of 17 prostrations and 34 genuflections every day. This so-called proskynesis is both a regression to the patriarch Abraham of Genesis and a declaration of faith in ancient Oriental despotism. While isolated attempts to make the gesture of submission, familiar from Persia, a fixed component of court ceremonial and/or religious ritual, were only able to establish themselves for a short time or in certain areas or among certain dignitaries among the ancient Greeks and Romans, in the Eastern and especially the Western Church, Islam succeeded in imposing its total generalization. The mosque is, according to its literal translation, the place of this prostration and traditionally a multifunctional house, nekla kalek, in which business is conducted, the political doctrines of the respective caliphs are proclaimed, the call to both small and large jihad is made, the social contribution, third pillar, is collected for the purpose of feeding the poor, mosque construction or financing the jihad, and God and Ummah are worshipped, in order to constantly reconstitute the determination and resolve of the collective as a unity of Allah worship, ritual purity, business and politics. Those who kneel down, writes Gerhard Scheidt, must still put their heads on the ground, and instead of the one great vicarious self-sacrifice, which is worshipped in a kneeling position because salvation has already occurred in its name, each individual who is thrown down is presented with death for the community of believers as a worthwhile goal. Not a passive suffering of the necessary sacrifice by the predestined Son of God, but the joyful achievement of the predetermined goal of an entire host of chosen ones in the war against the unbelievers. Surah 37 of the Quran, which deals with the eschatology of heaven and hell, the struggle of faith, the right and the consent of Isaac to his own sacrifice, is also called as Safat, which means those who stand in rank and file. Accordingly, the later Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan announced on December 6, 1997 at an election rally, "Democracy is only the train on which we climb until we reach our destination. The mosques are our barracks, the minarets are bayonets, the domes are helmets, and the faithful are soldiers." The Nazi collaborator and former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin el-Husseini, once said of Islamic rites, The various cults of Islam serve to educate people in order, obedience, and discipline. For example, prayer is an excellent exercise in this sense. Muslims must perform prayer in orderly rows under the guidance of the imam, just as orderly soldiers perform their duties under the guidance of their superior. It is correct to describe the prayer of Muslims as a daily military demonstration before God. The other cults of Islam, such as fasting and pilgrimage, also serve to educate people in order, discipline, and obedience. End of quote. It may be in the logic of the world market that it produces a disproportionately greater degree of material and spiritual misery in the peripheries than in its centers and metropolises. However, the concrete form of misery on the ground is also due, on the one hand, to the way in which the respective traditional culture of domination integrates the requirements of capital accumulation and thereby transforms itself. On the other hand, the specific nature of the respective spiritual and material misery also depends on which real or invented traditions a possible pathological crisis consciousness can mobilize against the negative side effects of precisely that social upheaval process. Two things are characteristic of the Orient in this regard. Firstly, and fundamentally, the collective impotence experienced by the impoverished masses here, in marked contrast to the marginalized regions of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Asia, for example, collides with the internalized fantasy of omnipotence of the Islamic Herrenvolk ideology. Instead of relying on secularization to combat the symbiosis of traditional despotic Islamic rule and capitalism that is responsible for the misery, and instead of fighting for the appropriation of the achievements of modernity, as they do against modernity, the Islamists declare that the cause of the misery is the apostasy of the faithful and their societies from the supposedly pure original Islam. They propagate the re-Islamization of the Ummah as a panacea. However, by trying to cast out the devil with the help of Beelzebub, the renewers are only creating an apocalyptic spiral of impoverishment that is constantly growing in intensity. Their telos is the modern suicide attack, in which the traditional small jihad against infidels and apostates and the traditional great jihad against one's own soul become identical in the nothingness of annihilation and celebrate their wedding night, as Sufism already glorified death. Secondly, the material misery that the Islamic revival movement's negative crisis solution always presupposes and at the same time creates is based on the crisis of specifically Oriental drive regulation that is inevitable in view of the totality of the world market. For classical Islamic phallocentrism organizes the renunciation of extramarital sex not only by desexualizing the public woman, so that the male drive is not even stimulated. Rather, and more decisively, the passion or devilish power that may be aroused by foreign women is to be banished in coitus with one's own wife. Consequently, as long as marriage is a stable institution, the renunciation of sexual desire is primarily a matter of sexual discharge. The great jihad against the ego does not require any great sacrifice, and the small jihad to enforce the chastity imperative against women does not have to be particularly rigorous either. But if the economic crisis turns the solvent patriarch into an unemployed good-for-nothing, then not only does the collective honor gain in importance for him in relation to his sinking individual reputation. In addition, the husband loses the moral and legal authority to enforce the sexual obedience of his wife with his income, just as the young man loses the means to marriage altogether. Insofar as the great jihad against the lower soul of the instincts demands total renunciation of the instincts, it is reduced to a terror of virtue against women, who are now much more threatening. This terror can no longer tolerate moderation, because suddenly one's own body must appear as a potential collaborator of all those who seek to seduce it and awaken its no longer controllable sensuality. According to the delusion, these are not only women but also Jews and the West. The promises of happiness of modernity, prosperity, individual freedom, love, happiness, which cannot be fulfilled under Sharia law even partially, become the object of obsessive hatred. The suicide attack promises salvation from the intensified but unmanageable inner ambivalences, and at the same time the elimination of all enemies of Islam. The murderous self-immolation is libidinous, ritualized and eschatologically charged, seeking to draw its energy from the earthly denial of the libido itself. It is directed towards the infantile and perversely distorted fulfillment of the hated bourgeois promise of happiness in the afterlife. Thus, it is ultimately the promised eternal defilement of virgins for which Islamic suicide bombers ritually cleanse their penises before the act and wrap them in a kind of sheath. The slogan of the Madrid suicide bombers, "You love life, we love death," sums it up. the negative sublation of Oriental phallocentrism on its own basis. In France, a pillar of the Republican self-image and an institution that is explicitly separate from the state have been attacked by Islamic practitioners within a few days. On October 16, 2020, Samuel Paty, a teacher in Paris who was entrusted with the task of spreading secularism, was beheaded, and on October 29, the sacristan Vincent Laux and the churchgoers Nadine de Villers and Simone Barreto Silva were murdered in Nice, in the case of Nadine de Villers, also by beheading, because they wanted to celebrate a Catholic service. Teacher Paty was tasked with working for the strict separation of religion and society and familiarizing his students with the declarations of tolerance, especially those of the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, which he demonstrated in class using the Muhammad cartoons from Charlie Hebdo as concrete material. The public dismay at the cruel end of Samuel Paty has not only led to a large demonstration in Paris despite the corona restrictions, but also to empathetic portrayals of his person in the media. In the case of Nice, it was the public outrage at renewed terror, the victims of which were commemorated at a public rally attended by Prime Minister Jean Castex, who in his speech at least pledged his support to the Catholic Church of France and all Catholic Christians. However, his key message was one of support for Islam. We know the enemy, not only because it is identified, but because it has a name, and that name is radical Islamism. This is a political ideology that distorts the Muslim religion by distorting its texts, dogmas, commandments in order to impose its claim to leadership, which consists of hatred and obscurantism. End of quote. He was thus echoing President Macron, who had said a week earlier, "We have been attacked because of our values, our enthusiasm for freedom," adding, "In France, there is only one community, and that is the community of the nation. I would like to say to all our fellow citizens, regardless of their religious affiliation, to those who are believers and those who are non-believers, that we must unite and under no circumstances give in to the spirit of division." End of quote. The objective division of society into supporters and opponents of Islam in all its forms, and the majority of the population who are harassed, terrorized, and terrorized by them, is being abandoned in favor of an authoritarian appeal to national unity, which is qualitatively based on a belief in a freedom that, in this conception, only begins beyond religious belief. Of course, everyone understood that Macron wanted to brand Islam as the real separatist. The fact that he dared to say what he had announced only at the price of discrediting Christianity and Judaism points to a tradition of exclusion inherent in the concept of the nation, which in its aggressiveness reveals the fear of the emptiness of national confession. On October 30, 2020, one day after the murder of the churchgoers in Nice and 13 days after the murder of Samuel Paty, the President of the Republic discredited the followers of two religions, neither of which has issued calls for murder, let alone carried them out. These people are not citizens in their place of worship, but members of their community and, beyond that, of the worldwide Christian or Jewish community. He has placed French people who are loyal and without resentment to the laws of the Republic and do not claim special rights in a row with those who, in France alone, openly admit their disloyalty to the Republic with open approval of Paty's murder. It serves him right, and secret approval. But he has seriously offended the feelings of the faithful. And Macron has not said a word about why the executors of Islam are targeting churches and churchgoers, and not only in France. The term oldest daughter of the church, which has been used increasingly in recent times, cannot bring about a change of principles in the homeland of the Enlightenment, as it has committed itself to an exclusive form of laicism in relation to Christianity and at best recognizes Catholicism as a cultural heritage in the form of architectural monuments. In reality, the Church is preoccupied with self-referentiality and the celebration of Marian experiences or neo-mystical meditation exercises, while the state establishment, in conjunction with all the major political groups and the public, is trumpeting its claim to sole Republican representation ever more loudly, even against Christians, the more indeterminate its own identity-forming offer proves to be in the crisis. Since the laws on the separation of church and state were enacted in 1905, Catholics have been left with only the right to practice their religion freely. Their religion is considered a cult like any other. But since it was only Catholics who were affected, and not the much smaller groups of Protestants and Jews who were not privileged anyway, professing Catholics who had already been dismissed by the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century as the Pope's followers, who were not open to reason, saw themselves as losers whose initially considerable influence gradually waned after 1945. For years, official France had turned a blind eye to the ever-increasing attacks on Christians and, above all, their churches, not only as an expression of submission to the Islamic aggressor, but also out of a lack of empathy with the victims, who are not accepted as real, ergo enlightened French people. The fire at Notre Dame in Paris, the model for the smaller neo-Gothic copy in Nice, showed that there could still be a bond between the two for a few eventful days in 2019, probably not least because of the ultimately unfounded suspicion that Islamic believers could have set the fire. But the shock at the near loss of the country's most famous building has led to nothing more than the public rejection of typically Republican secular appropriations through abominable modernist-inspired defacements of the cathedral in favor of a faithful reconstruction. Teachers and churchgoers have each emphasized in their own limited way that the first organized teachings in the monasteries necessarily had to be followed by an education system emancipated from the direct influence of Christianity. On the other hand, the increasingly less attended church services, through their mere ritualized form, are still able to express an objection to the confessions of a collective reason, which has lost all promise of reconciliation since the expulsion of metaphysics. Thus, in times of Islamic separatism, as it is officially called, nation and Catholicism remain not only institutionally separate to the mutual detriment of both. There are numerous attacks on churches, not only in France, and in most cases the perpetrators cannot be identified. Even though it is likely that Muslims make up the majority of perpetrators, as the location of the attacked churches in or near problem districts often indicates, vandals from a seemingly completely different milieu in the Republic also come along, some of whom are affiliated with satanic cults, profess left-wing radicalism, or just want to have a laugh. According to the Saarbrücker Zeitung newspaper of February 17, 2019, the words "fuck tourism" were sprayed on the Sacré-Cœur Church in Paris in 2014, with the addition of "Long live the Commune," whereby the graffiti writers were referring to a practice of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic regime, when churches and monasteries were used as stables, for example, with the express intention of desecrating them. Many supporters of the Spanish Republic have also taken a terrible revenge on Catholicism since its foundation in 1931. The pent-up anger over the close ties between the Church and the repressive state cannot be used to justify the numerous murders of monks, rapes of nuns, and looting of churches and monasteries, and it obscures the view of the liberation that took place. In both cases, the rage of the suppressed, now released, and the administrators of liberation, who were once again acting on behalf of the state, was directed against a representative of the old order who was only indirectly in power, whose authority, even in a state of defeat, still triggered aggression and feelings of guilt at the same time. In this tradition, Islam and the children of the Republic march separately today, but together they attack an institution that, by its very existence, stands in the way of a social nihilism that, in one case, is articulated in tags or urinated upon holy water basins, and in the other goes beyond that to include intimidation, threats, and murderous terror against believers. The enforcers of Islam see not only the poor state of repair and the lack of protection of churches, visible signs of the public insignificance of Christianity in France, as an opportunity to spread terror without great risk. They know from their own countries of origin, whether it be the Maghreb or, more recently, Mali and the Ivory Coast, that the systematic terror against small Christian minorities, Mali, and formerly even majorities, Ivory Coast, is the decisive preparatory act for the establishment of the respective caliphate in two respects. Murders and mass expulsions not only change the population proportions in favor of the Ummah, they also extinguish hopes for a more friendly society, which manifests itself above all in the defenseless Christian communities and institutions. At least the French Republic has honored the memory of the Christians who were killed, and at least it has also taken measures against the Islamic disaster. The resentment against Christianity is most carefree where the victims of Islam are not allowed to have a name, the traces of the perpetrators are carefully erased, and Islam is considered to be the religion of peace. In Germany, the home of the Counter-Enlightenment, the country where Thomas Lips, who was stabbed to death by an Islamic perpetrator in Dresden on October 4, 2020, is still called Thomas L. Where the public was kept in the dark about the background to the crime for almost 3 weeks, people regularly get into a state of agitation when criticism of Islam is called for. This is the high hour of general criticism of religion, whose representatives put the members of the world's most persecuted religion on a par with their persecutors, as if the completely unreflected generic term religion could be used to identify murderers and murder victims as adherents of the same fundamental evil. Even before the 3 worshippers from Nice had to give up their lives, a renowned author and speaker at a meeting, who is the scientific director of an Austrian organization that nobody knows, provided information in the Taz on October 20th, 2020 about the prerequisite that must never be abandoned in the rejection of Islamic-inspired murders. It is the disparagement of the followers of Christianity and Judaism as backwoodsmen who are ultimately capable of committing fundamentalist mass murders. To fuel this resentment, which he cheekily and falsely calls religious criticism, was Stefan Grigget's most important concern as a critic in times of Islamic terror. It is difficult to talk about religious criticism in 2020, says the man who is actually not plagued by any doubts, because it is difficult to revive the battles of the Middle Ages. The question arises as to how people who seriously claim in the 21st century that there are higher beings, and thus quite voluntarily and without coercion, descend to the intellectual level of a few hundred years ago, should be criticized. One would be happy to limit oneself to exchanging the best jokes about prophets, Jesus, and the Messiah. It is likely to be noticed how terrible this statement sounds in the light of the murders in Notre Dame de Nice 9 days later. Less attention is paid to statements such as the following. If a few harmless cartoons can trigger a minor rebellion halfway around the world since the beginning of the millennium, if groups like Hamas win elections, then Islam, which is to blame for this, must be the focus of harsh, non-relativistic criticism. This is how the argument should have continued, but Grigget's sentence ends like this. When an esoteric obscurantist with a penchant for feudalist power structures like the Dalai Lama acts as a role model for entire generations across all political boundaries, when Catholic homophobia in Poland and Russian Orthodox homophobia in Moscow once again appear as militant mobs, when something that has been declared dead 1,000 times over is now proving to be extremely alive, in the case of jihadist Islam, so alive that it represents a deadly threat to unbelievers, then we would have to go back to the beginning and remind ourselves of the fundamentals of religious criticism. End of quote. The Dalai Lama's admirers in the West do not murder. His followers in Tibet are partly involved in murderous revolts against the Han Chinese's master race mentality, with whose, after all, atheistically motivated cleansing of feudalist power structures one should somehow come to terms in the spirit of the great critic Jutta Dittfurth. The often very ugly and militant followers of an evil state cult, Russian Orthodoxy, do not murder either, and the disparagement of Catholicism by means of the Polish mockery, which is still available in Germany and has been popular for over 150 years, should be self-evident for a German critic. So what is the point of religious criticism in the eyes of the Griggets of this world? The question that inevitably arises as to the differences between Christianity and Islam is introduced by Manfred Dieks, who must have been the victim of terrible religiously motivated violence. Quote, the question of why the last two Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Kurt Westergaard have to live with criticism, outrage, and, in the worst case, with ludicrous criminal consequences, just as Manfred Dieks did for a long time, while Aya Ali, however, was confronted with death threats and Kurt Westergaard with attempted murders, can only be explained if an attempt is made in the future to address the crucial differences between the religions and their respective functions in today's societies. End of quote. The instrumentalization of Manfred Dieks is also inadmissible, because in his last interview in 2016, he had despaired, "I only draw with the burqa now. You obviously can't joke with these gentlemen with the long beards. We are experiencing a new totalitarian threat here. If I were to joke about Muhammad, I would be in danger of my life. My voice is almost failing me. I'm suffering like a dog. It's a catastrophe." End of quote. The qualitative distinction that would have been important is conspicuously absent from Grigget's text. He was not allowed to say more than that radical Islam is more brutal than Christianity, if he did not want to embarrass his concept of religious criticism. Instead, he postulates, today, it is a matter of defending the civil liberties of people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who called the Prophet a perverse tyrant. End of quote. Even this poor but at least acceptable statement is followed not by a full stop, but by a comma, after which it continues, by hip-hoppers who call Jesus a bastard, and by Israeli pop leftists who proclaim that the Messiah will not come. End of quote. Grigget, who could of course also be Sasha Lobo or Kevin Kunert, who made similar observations at the same time in Der Spiegel, ends like those, of course, with the inevitable warning against right-wing populism, which is attributed to anyone who does not accuse Manfred Dieks of being a victim of Christian fundamentalism before even approaching the motives of the murderer of Samuel Paty. Quote, if leftists and liberals are not even willing to criticize radical Islamism and those elements of orthodox conservative majority Islam that threaten the emancipatory achievements of Western societies, Anti-cosmopolitan political formations will continue to succeed with their Islam criticism, which are not nearly as far removed from the object of their criticism in terms of antisemitism, misogyny, and homophobia as they would like to suggest. End of quote. Those who only use the popular, but linguistically incorrect intensifier radical Islamism to refer to Islamism will only mention criticism of Islam once in an entire article, and then in quotation marks as a kind of disguised Islamism. Anyone who is serious about criticizing religion would have to recognize that Kant, Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud were not talking about Islam, but about Christianity and, to a very limited extent, Judaism. Criticism of religion is, by its very nature, a post-theological discipline of thinkers who, long before Kant examined Christian beliefs, questioned them in part and ultimately rejected them entirely, granting philosophy, as the little sister of theology, the sole claim to represent the question of what truth is. Hegel notes that the defining characteristic of Islam, as opposed to Christianity, is its conception of God without limits and without definition, which can only require the individual subject to live as the realization of this generality and purity, and, as part of this, to dismiss the bodily feeling of distinctiveness and, as the highest merit, to die for the faith. Quote, the Muslims were dominated by abstraction. Their goal was to assert the abstract service, and they strove for this with the greatest enthusiasm. This enthusiasm was fanaticism, i.e., an enthusiasm for an abstract thought that negates the existing. Fanaticism is essentially only by the fact that it is destructive against the concrete. End of quote. And Hegel draws a parallel to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, which, in its anti-metaphysical, anti-Catholic, atheistic furor and the idolization of the abstract concept of the nation, turns into a new civic religiosity and practice that is equal to Islam. La religion et la terror was the principle here, as with Robespierre la liberté et la terror. Islam is mentioned only in passing by Schopenhauer, Marx, and Jacob Burckhardt, who all agree that this system of belief and rule can only be the object of contempt and not of criticism. It would therefore be important to emphasize that when religion is discussed critically, it can only be Christianity and, to a limited extent, Judaism. This applies to any reflection on theology that is not guided by resentment, which does not exist in other faiths that are apostrophized as religion, while it is already inherent in Judaism and Christianity in the holy books. Not every organized belief in a higher being and life after death is open to criticism, but only theology that presupposes a distance from the revealed Word of God and makes the daring attempt to justify faith by means of reason, ultimately in vain, in order to reconcile both moments. But the criticism of Christianity, which has long since been conclusively dealt with, is still being cultivated as a pseudo-enlightened objection to its long-abandoned objection to an enlightenment at a pathetic level. For the bad battles of the Middle Ages were the beginning of enlightened thinking, as well as a criticism of it. Horkheimer noted that what had been lost about the Christian religion, and not about other religions, was what was once different about it, the longing for the other, in which this world proves to be the bad one. The fact that the other can only be found in two religions at all is just as much left out as the fact that Christianity in particular, and theologically also Judaism, are in a miserable state of decline. Which, in the spirit of German critics of religion, is actually quite a welcome contrast to the dark Middle Ages, because only pragmatic soul work is done, which is aimed at hardening the damaged life for the adjustments that are made to it. What religion once stood for is no longer of interest to a critique of religion, which, on the contrary, is all the more strutting when the official credo of both Christian denominations and Judaism consists in the partial explicit denial of wanting to stand for the entirely different beyond the exact sciences and their reason, thus de facto resigning. In order to help criticism of Islam to its right, the non-Islamic trivializers and euphemists would have to be relentlessly pilloried in public. But that is not enough. Rather, it would be necessary to examine why a German feuilletonist and a French philosophy professor refer approvingly to the anti-colonial fantasies of violence of a Franz Fanon and are still appreciated for it. Or why people who have the complete works of Horkheimer and Adorno on their bookshelves are not even capable of recognizing Islam as the greatest threat of this century. Why they have no sympathy for the Armenian refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh or the persecuted African Christians. They shy away from this because they suspect that they would then have to name who is closer to them, the Christians or their murderers. Based on this closeness, they would have to be able to explain why the one group kills and the other does not call for revenge, why the one group cultivates their fields and the other, as nomads, drive their cattle into them in a very manly way and organize a massacre when they are resisted. By emphasizing the last set-building block formulas, such as the emancipatory achievements of Western societies, are to be defended and misogynistic, homophobic, and anti-Semitic anti-cosmopolitan elements are to be, it is not even possible to develop an idea of what has hardened the minds of so many inhabitants of the geographical West to such an extent that they are incapable of solidarity with the persecuted and therefore also of collective self-protection. Christianity, and particularly the Catholic denomination, is not only hated in Germany, although here in this country, the result of a stunted enlightenment is particularly powerful. Child abuse, obscurantism, celibacy, the Crusades, the Dark Ages, the Inquisition, homophobia. These words are hammers against which no argument can stand. They have been unpacked for many years, whenever Christians have not even made a timid attempt to name the differences between Islam and Christianity. The mere statement that fewer and fewer offended Christians are taking blasphemy to court, the suggestion that peaceful followers of a peaceful religion cannot be put on the same level as perpetrators and hundreds of millions of people who understand the acts, or even the demand that the privilege of free exercise of religion should be restricted for those who condone civil war and mass murder in their places of worship, all this does not simply go unheard, but is immediately countered with accusations of right-wing populism and Christian bashing. And no one should believe Grigot when he says that right-wing opponents of Islam are somehow secretly in favor of Christianity or Islam. Like their secular opponents, they have enough ammunition from the church struggle and the National Socialist mockery of Christians to slander Christians of both denominations as unreliable and dishonest waverers and weaklings, and it is not they, but their mostly left-wing opponents who recognize potential for resistance in Islam that should be built on. The question is not what would be needed to stop the spread and radicalization of Islam. It would be easy to answer, to confront Islam with repression, a refusal to engage in dialogue and a restrictive immigration policy, and to finally stop addressing immigrants from Islamic countries as prospective citizens instead of as Muslims. But that would be a helpless appeal to a state that orients its policies towards ideologues who, in their hunt for Islam critics, warn against panic mongers, Patrick Bonners, FAZ, and our hate preachers, Thomas Steinfeld, SZ, with quotation marks. As long as the heavyweight feuilletonist Patrick Bonners continues to come up with sentences that are hard to beat for linguistic depravity and thus point to the lie they convey, the front line on which critics should take up their positions is already marked out. Quote, "The precious is usually wrapped in cloth. The veiling is an indication of nobility. It therefore contradicts our intuition that the purpose of the headscarf, as claimed by its feminist opponents, is to demonstratively demean women." End of quote. Compare this outpouring with a quote from Franz Fanon. "Every veil that is taken off opens up previously closed horizons for the colonialists and shows them, piece by piece, the exposed Algerian flesh. A woman who sees without being seen creates a feeling of powerlessness in the colonizer. There is no interaction. She does not give herself away, does not give herself away, does not offer herself." End of quote. Bonners is not far from the French philosopher and Fanon admirer Elsa Dorlin, who caused a stir in Germany this fall with her book, Self-Defense, A Philosophy of Violence, which deals with strategies allegedly only used by slaves, women, and Jews, however these groups may be related. In the same issue of Die Welt from October 30th, 2020, in which Nekla Kalek, Seren Atesh, and several other Islam critics published an appeal entitled Let's Stop Political Islam, one day after the murders in Nice, an interview with Elsa Dorlin appeared a few pages further on. She granted the perpetrators of the Paris and Nice attacks, who were not committed to philosophy but to the ideology of violence, and their fans the right to organize themselves against Islamophobic and racist thinking. Quote, "The question is how fascism and terrorism are related to racist statements that would simply not have been possible 20 years ago. The attacks have nothing to do with Islam, but are fascist terror. This terror in turn feeds nationalist and Islamophobic thinking. The French Interior Minister, for example, considered removing products from supermarkets that are not even halal, but are simply used to prepare couscous. We are coming to almost insane definitions of what France should be. We are in an ideological war. The very possibility of debate has become rancid in France. We have a nationalist backlash that also makes terrorism possible." End of quote. And of course, only slaves, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and the suffragettes with their knowledge of jiu-jitsu are mentioned when Dorlan ends the conversation in a completely non-violent way. Those who are not considered worthy of protection by the state have no choice but to defend themselves. I show this historically in my book. I don't mean armed struggle, but the struggle for one's own material living conditions. The inevitable consequence is self-organization and a growing will to take these rights for oneself in order to obtain justice. I am interested in resistance that organizes itself from the bottom up. End of quote. Self-organization, resistance from below, taking the power to break the law in the name of a justice formulated against the law. This is the program of Frantz Fanon, the philosopher and psychiatrist of violence, whose program, as laid out in The Wretched of the Earth, was enthusiastically outlined by Jean-Paul Sartre in the foreword to the first edition. To kill a European is to kill two birds with one stone, namely to simultaneously eliminate an oppressor and an oppressed. End of quote. In 1960, Fanon had already asserted, albeit not without doubt, that only Islam could guarantee liberation, something that neither Sartre nor anyone else who read him ever took issue with. Quote, "Every veil that is taken off, every body that frees itself from the traditional shackles of the haik, every face that presents itself to the insolent and impatient gaze of the occupier, expresses in a negative way that Algeria is beginning to deny itself and that it is accepting the rape by the colonizer." End of quote. The traditional veil has now become almost obligatory in Algeria and is hardly ever questioned. Not only in France, although everyone knows that it is more than an expression of the subjugation of women to crude male rights. It is the symbol of a resistance that is admittedly initially concerned with the emancipation of the predominantly Islamic districts from the laws of the Republic and then with power in the entire state. The comradeship that the feminist Elsa Dorlans, who set the tone on campus, at the book market, at the Documenta and in parties and associations, entertain with the real murderers and women's veilers points to a fundamental loyalty problem of the constitutional state, which harbors the danger of civil war and is often discussed in Germany with reference to the Bakenford dilemma. In 1964, the future constitutional judge Ernst Wolfgang Bakenford gave a lecture at an event in honor of the Nazi jurist Ernst Forsthoff in the presence of the Nazi constitutional lawyer Carl Schmitt. The liberal, secularized state lives on conditions that it cannot guarantee itself. He added, "This is the great risk that it has taken for the sake of freedom. On the one hand, it can only exist as a liberal state if the freedom that it grants its citizens is regulated from within, from the moral substance of the individual and the homogeneity of society. On the other hand, it cannot seek to guarantee these internal regulatory forces on its own, that is, by means of legal coercion and authoritative command, without giving up its freedom and, on a secularized level, falling back into the claim to totality from which it emerged in the confessional civil wars." End of quote. In other words, the best constitutional order will not function if the subjects subject to it do not have a fundamental understanding on the essential issues of social coexistence. Such a commonality cannot arise immediately from the law, nor could it be enforced by corresponding legal regulations. Rather, the reverse is true. If the legal order is not to be in vain, it is an expression of a prior social order from which it draws its substance. One might think of experiences made with civil wars, totalitarian rule, or the impositions that emanated from the official churches, but also of the always helpless attempt to live according to one's own legislation, which is intended to connect the individual with the others in mutual recognition of each one's own particularity. What the best legislator cannot achieve, the respective value campaign against the right will accomplish just as little as an appeal to a new spiritual, possibly even Christian self-assurance. And yet, modern and specifically bourgeois, formally determined, abstract general law is even more dependent on extralegal conditions than legal provisions with natural law and religious connotations. Precisely because it no longer captures particular circumstances in each individual case, but systematically abstracts from particular situations and the peculiarities of the individual. Because the abstract general law no longer postulates immediate substantive material provisions of general welfare or justice, but represents formal procedural law, it is dependent on social homogeneity. Even if civil law abstracts from the religious connotations of natural law and sees itself as a human creation in a positivist sense, a moment of religion is retained all the more through the specific nature of abstraction, as a necessary final reconnection of the law to its own unprovable and unconditional principles. If this homogeneity does not exist, this link is lost, and in the extreme case abstract general law becomes the prey of arbitrary neutral means to suspend the law. This is precisely why those who only apply formal criteria such as language acquisition and the declaration of loyalty to the Constitution as a condition for integration are playing into the hands of the enemies of the law. This consequently leads to the statements of the former Integration Commissioner of the German government, Aden Ozoguz, who defined the multicultural society by saying that in it, life must be negotiated anew every day. A reasonably predictable life with expected actions on the part of others is no longer possible, which means that the law itself would no longer be based on any self-evident conditions. Conversely, life as a permanent negotiation would become a permanent legal act, except that this law would no longer be a law, but a pseudo-law with an immediate moral burden. The old problem of the bourgeois state periodically returns in times of crisis. The slogan, "No freedom for the enemies of freedom," was an answer as early as the French Revolution. Rousseau's civic religion was another, itself highly totalitarian and terrorist, Hegel. In the Weimar Republic, and in modern mass democracy in general, the problem re-emerged in Carl Schmitt's concept of the political as a condition of institutionalized politics and distinct from it. In 1964, Bachenford, a student of Schmitt's who did not sympathize with his Nazi leanings, made the following apt observation about the Federal Republic of Germany. After 1945, especially in Germany, people sought to find a new basis for homogeneity in the commonality of existing value convictions. But this recourse to values, when its immediate content is questioned, is a highly inadequate and also dangerous substitute. It opens the field to the subjectivism and positivism of daily valuations, which, each demanding objective validity for itself, destroy freedom rather than found it. Values are, as it were, the general clause that everyone interprets in one way or another depending on the political situation and tries to enforce their interpretation by force. The political can only be defined in negative terms, as demarcation, exclusion, and expulsion, as practiced intolerance. It becomes concrete in the face of a crisis or a threat, such as that posed by Islam, as a possible realization of what unites the majority against an enemy that practices land seizure by legal means and constantly raises the question of power. It is true that civil law not only embodies the American idea of the pursuit of happiness, but also the even more transcendent idea of general reconciliation in the secular world. And not because constitutions like to have lofty prefaces referring to God or to inalienable human rights, but because the systematic nature of civil law has achieved a degree of formal generality that makes the individual, abstracted from his or her particularities, almost unrecognizable. But precisely for this reason, the content-based assumption of a liberated world cannot be completely abandoned, because it fundamentally contradicts particular counterrights. The dilemma is not solved, because civil law cannot take away the individual's fear of extinction and certainly cannot insist on its application against an unwilling state and a despondent judiciary. A temporary suspension of the conflict, which can never be completely resolved, could be achieved if, in the face of extraordinary danger, a majority could be convinced not only of the necessity of preserving the legal order, but also of the possibility of achieving something better on its basis. It is precisely against this possibility, which is covered by opinion polls that are critical of Islam, that the primarily journalistic and cultural establishment is directing all its power. In connection with Islam, Bachenford has recently been criticized in a way that seems to be entirely in line with Franz Neumann, who in the last years of the Weimar Republic defended the expropriation of means of production by means of appropriate laws as compatible with the democratic state against Carl Schmitt and Schmitt's claim that a value system that cannot be attacked by parliamentary majorities is thoroughly democratic and partly right-wing positivist. No one would have bothered with Bachenford if the 90-year-old had not made himself unpopular in 2010 when he remarked in an interview, "From the state's point of view, the liberal order needs a unifying ethos, a kind of public spirit among those who live in this state. The question then is, what feeds this ethos, which cannot be enforced by the state or implemented by sovereign power? One could say initially from the culture that is lived. But what are the factors and elements of this culture? We are then indeed at sources such as Christianity, the Enlightenment, and humanism, but not automatically at every religion." End of quote. This has prompted Thomas Steinfeld, one of the most vehement and even more ardent supporters of Patrick Bonner's campaign against critics of Islam, to take the stage. In 2010, Steinfeld also disputed the strengthening of a bourgeois common sense against a very specific totalitarian threat as itself totalitarian, and imposed a special preamble on the bourgeois legal system that it had never worn: tolerance. Tolerance is not a bourgeois legal concept, but a pragmatic agreement after the denominationally motivated wars and civil wars in Europe, which arose from the late realization that nothing fundamentally different separates the Christian denominations or sects, and later also Judaism, from each other. Tolerance should really only be a temporary attitude. It must lead to recognition. To tolerate is to insult, Goethe soberly stated, without being able to foresee the abuse that would be made of his maxim over 200 years later. For what applies to the relationship of the Christian denominations and Judaism to the state and to each other does not apply to other legal spheres. The state is explicitly intolerant towards lawbreakers. The Penal Code, for example, is a catalogue of intolerance, as is the tax code. According to the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany, citizens are not obliged to tolerate anyone or to tolerate any fellow citizens. Their rights, including the right to free speech, are guaranteed by the law, supplemented by a lived agreement according to which the other person's quirk is either smiled at or admired, and sometimes only reluctantly tolerated. Islam critics such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Nekla Kalek, who were targeted by Bonners and Steinfeld, were initially only concerned with the disqualification of Islamic practices, which necessarily includes criticism of the underlying moral concepts, in order to press for better protection of dissidents and critics. In doing so, they outlined, without saying it, what Rainer Ruthermund had already stated in 1997, 4 years before September 11th. Quote, "If it is the case that we are dealing with a consciousness that takes its own God so seriously that it does not consider him to be equal to all others and thus publicly irrelevant to human coexistence, i.e. beyond the private sphere, then there is an irreconcilable conflict with the postulate of tolerance." End of quote. Steinfeld, who was then the head of the feature section of the Süddeutsche Zeitung, took the objections of Hirsi Ali and others as an opportunity to address Bachenford's dilemma. Quote, "But if you treat Western values as aggressively as radical Islam treats its holy scriptures, then you are behaving like the enemy you have chosen. And what is worse, you destroy the social and moral institutions that you claim to defend. This is due to the dialectic of these values. For those who insist on tolerance, tolerance cannot stop when someone else does not want to be tolerant. Those who demand freedom must expect freedom to lead to baseness and greed. And those who subscribe to equality must not call the police when they encounter individual interests. In other words, anyone who treats the basic principles of democracy as if they were articles of faith, commandments that one must profess, has already been infected by the mindset of their opponents. That is why it is not good for the democratic values to be identified with them. No, if they ever work at all, then as everyday practice, as a lived order." End of quote. The trick in the argumentation is as easy to see through as a sermon by Heinrich Bedfordstrom. According to Steinfeld, all the articles of faith and commandments postulated by Islamic or other authoritarian communities are to be accepted in unlimited tolerance. The fact that someone takes the liberty of being base and greedy can never be ruled out, but when they are supposedly acting in their own interest, it is ingenious in its audacity not to call the police, especially when we are talking about Islam and not about evil neighbors. Debates on values, as initiated by Nekla Kalek, Seren Atesh, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, are almost always helpless and insipid, at best an attempt to awaken the idea of a threat that can only be defined negatively by appealing to the righteous. Anyone who publicly calls for serious crimes or explicitly condones them should be targeted by the public prosecutor's office and brought to court. Anyone who forces children to starve for 4 weeks should, in turn, first be removed from the children by the police and handed over to the Youth Welfare Office for custody until a court decides on further action. The problem is not some kind of Western values that need to be invoked, but the fact that the authorities, despite having the power to intervene, do not act to avert dangers or prevent further harm when identitarian communities, of which Islam is the largest and most dangerous, threaten to sue for special collective rights or even murder. When someone like Steinfeld talks about tolerance, he does not want to appeal unnecessarily to people who are basically kindred spirits to refrain from acts of violence and discrimination against each other. Rather, he wants to see the motives of criminals who are driven by offended honor, for that is what the greedy and vile people he is referring to really are, and their completely non-violent admirers protected by the police, the courts, the legislature, and, first and foremost, of course, by public opinion as a legitimate expression of their identity. Thus, the denied right to call the police against Islamic calls for civil war is transformed from tolerance into respect, that empty esteem of other people whose only merit is their being, which they insist on all the more energetically the more questionable the nature of their identity is. In this way, they are not only removed from the perspective of the law, but rather they expect the adaptation of the prevailing law to their particular identity, which is always personally affected and at the same time collectively sealed off from any criticism. The concepts are not only blurred in Thomas Steinfeld's work. Islam in Western countries is extremely violent in its compliance with and often promotion of what the disintegrating society in its midst tolerates. The ideological terror of those who are somehow empowered, among whom the followers of the so-called queer theory with their transgender subjects are currently particularly prominent. If they do not get everything they demand, then, in the words of Elsa Dorlin, the consequence is inevitably self-organization and a growing will to take these rights for themselves in order to obtain justice. I am interested in resistance that organizes itself from the bottom up. End of quote. What interests Dorlin, Steinfeld, and Bedfordstrom is not the completely different, which Horkheimer still emphasized as Christian with regard to the betrayed reconciliation against institutionally suffocated Christianity. They want to see the already familiar and possibly even intensified fascism in the form of the Islamic self-empowerment of the offended, whose announced and already begun revenge campaign they celebrate just when, quite literally, heads are rolling. For what else can the perverse thesis that the attacks have nothing to do with Islam, but are fascist terror, Dorlin, mean other than the encouragement of the greedy and the vile, Steinfeld, to continue, which is called tolerance? After November 13, 2015, the central question will not be whether the IS in Iraq and Syria will be crushed. That will probably happen soon and quite thoroughly. What is more important is whether and how the small Islamic states that already exist in most Western European countries will be crushed. The fact that this is not likely to happen, and why, must be at the center of anti-German criticism, and specifically in the hope that the process of subjugation to what is, as the saying goes, a culture that enriches us can perhaps still be reversed. Even more important than the documentation of the horrific state of affairs in the numerous Islamic hellholes in Western cities, which is nevertheless necessary because it has been willfully neglected, is the question of the nature of a we that, after the massacre of November 13, 2015, apparently defiantly presented its own values. Hertha fans, we will not let terror take away our zest for life, was the headline in the Berliner Kurier on November 23, 2015, for example, and it is no less stupid than serious and critical publications. They tried to do the same thing with Paris, on a similarly bleak level, and declared the city to be a metropolis of joie de vivre, beauty, artistry, and fulfilled lives. No one should be denied the opportunity to attend a concert at the Bataclan or to eat at a Cambodian restaurant. But joie de vivre, an atmosphere of art and happiness, even artificial paradises, can hardly be combined with such leisure activities. Forget for a moment the hard life in a big city, where even those who earn more than the average can no longer afford anything more than a kind of living toilet, and imagine the state of people who struggle to be exuberant, cultured, and relaxed at the weekend. To realize that they are not, but at most achieve a modest approximation of the desired attitude to life, because tiredness, existential worries, and a general dullness quite objectively prevent them from doing so. You don't need to study the works of Marx or Adorno. And yet, precisely where one would expect a reflection on the circumstances that lead one to the Bataclan, for example, only a somewhat more cosmopolitan version of the attitude of Berlin football fans is offered as a self-assurance against terror. This joie de vivre has also crept into an editorial by Thomas von der Ostensacken, which appeared in Jungle World on November 19, 2015. The text, which is full of contradictions, reveals the confusion in anti-German and pro-Israeli circles. Ostensacken is absolutely right when he says, "The capital of vice and debauchery was attacked by the fighters of the Caliphate, the Islamic State announced after the Paris massacres. If there is anywhere in Europe that still symbolizes a better life, ideas of a freer and more beautiful world, that is what they mean by vice and debauchery, then it is indeed the French capital." End of quote. His more detailed comments also begin promisingly. And if there is anything to defend in Europe, it is certainly not the values monotonously and listlessly invoked by Brussels politicians, which no one actually knows what they mean anymore anyway, and it is certainly not a German Leitkultur either. But the sentence continues. It is the ideas associated with the Paris of Baudelaire, Benjamin, and Zola. These ideas should not only be defended against the Islamists with the militancy of the bare-breasted Marianne, who leads the people to the barricades in Delacroix's famous painting, but also against a Europe itself that, as it unfortunately seems these days, has given up and offers little more than visits for dialogue in Tehran, tired diplomatic phrases and nationalist marches that, if they take place in Paris, are reminiscent of another, very unpleasant French tradition. End of quote. The author knows that his affirmative flight of fancy is not going to work out, and adds, "What we need to do now is fight for a Europe that only exists in the fantasies and projections of Islamist warriors." End of quote. And one would agree with this intentionally exaggerated statement. The hymnic image of Paris is skewed and unintentionally points to its opposite. The thoroughly unsensual boor Émile Zola is indeed a good match for the bare-breasted Marianne on the barricades, who as an allegory of the Republic stands for something other than sensuality and profane happiness. For he was a fighter for social improvements and, see Dreyfus, against falsification, lies, and prejudgment. But if Paris had been characterized as a revolutionary, vicious, shimmering metropolis, then the literary heroes would have had to be, alongside Baudelaire, a monarchist who was almost obsessed with money and an elitist provincial who deeply despised the liberal bourgeoisie, Honoré de Balzac and Gustave Flaubert. All three rightly saw the bourgeoisie at the zenith of its power as the liquidator of passions and intoxication, of beauty and art, and ultimately even of the hope for it. The Revolution of 1830, in fact, points to the victory of a just milieu, whose ideals are embodied far better by the cunning small-mindedness and embarrassing apostle of progress Monsieur James, the pharmacist from Madame Bovary, than by the unhappy junkie Charles Baudelaire, who in reality belonged nowhere. Even in the 19th century, the victory of the Republic was synonymous with lost illusions for anyone who had more in mind than making a quick profit. Since then, these illusions have been resolutely expressed in an anti-bourgeois, and thus always elitist, manner against a nation. Those who wanted nothing to do with artificial paradises, but who tolerated an often suspicious artistic avant-garde and their excesses in the capital and only there, in the shadow of the red light district. Nevertheless, in this French Republic, which was founded on revolutions and not against them, there is still something like a promise among those who have been cast out by it, which is not only to be found in the fantasies and projections of jihadists, turned into their opposite. In Austin Sackens' words, "The revulsion that the Paris of the French Revolution, of civilization, of free love and of savoir-vivre evokes is only too well known in Europe. Even in all the anti-French propaganda of Germanic origin in the 19th century against the easygoing Marianne, a very similar anti-emancipatory and anti-modern resentment was expressed. Anyone who loved death and destruction more than life, especially the life celebrated, at least in their fantasies, on the banks of the Seine, consumed themselves in hatred of France and its capital, where the Jews, the incarnation of modernity, had also received full civil rights for the first time in Europe thanks to the Revolution." End of quote. The contrast between civilization, free love, savoir-vivre versus love of death and destruction points to the beginning of anti-German criticism and thus to a whole history of misunderstandings. I confront the thoroughly anti-German remarks of Thomas von der Ostensacken with a quote from a speech by Joachim Brun that was not given because it was not wanted by the organizers. To break the intellectual heritage of state capitalism through a new enlightenment of the left, that seems to me to be the essential intention of the beautiful slogan, "Never Again Germany." If you read it in a materialistic way, it says nothing more than a rejection not only of nationalism, but of the nation itself. In order to be able to criticize the new Germany, the left must free itself from its own national consciousness, must dismiss the fixed idea that the concept of the nation can somehow be linked to progressive and humanistic purposes. The left has interpreted the nation long enough. What matters is to revolutionize and liquidate the nation-state. End of quote. We are currently very much dealing with the reaffirmation of nation and national consciousness in anti-German circles. In any case, Ostensacken has done exactly this in relation to France, albeit cautiously and retrospectively. One could say, by way of qualification, that Brun was only talking about Germany here and could have seen other forms of national consciousness in a fundamentally different way. But there is little to support this. Both statements, the very recent and the very old, are mutually exclusive, and since 9/11 it sometimes seems as if Joachim Brun of all people had outlived his usefulness and as if anti-German criticism were now only oriented towards the dichotomies of Germany versus the free world, blood right versus just solely, republic on a revolutionary basis versus post-national socialist people's state, and culminating in love of life versus death. France in particular could be used to show how a not-at-all German form of bureaucratic capitalism led to the conditions in Saint-Denis and other banlieues, i.e. where the perpetrators of the mass murder of November 13th lived or found accommodation, and what devastating role the left, which is mostly dependent on the state and believes in it, and which of course claims to be full of joie de vivre, has played in this to this day. Criticism of the nation as a form of socialization that can be determined both economically and in terms of power should therefore begin precisely where the rebels of the Republic are conniving with the jihad against the Republic. Where a regime of clerics, the administrators of politics, state, doctrine, poverty administration, and often still the economy, which is close to the state or dependent on state protection, maintains an order that, in the name of equality, promotes the development of the most extreme inequality in the parallel societies. In the name of fraternity, it forces all economic subjects not supported by the state to pay for the clerics, who are superfluous in every respect, and sells this to its own countrymen and the whole world as liberté. We are faced with a liberté that extends from the Front National to the jihadist suburbs, from Monsieur le President to his conservative opponents, and that has nothing to do with the French Jews who have been equal to the rights for so long whenever they are attacked, threatened with death, and increasingly often actually murdered. Nevertheless, Thomas von der Ostensacken is undoubtedly right on a more abstract level, and this is also one of the misunderstandings of 25 years of anti-German sentiment. When he desperately clings to the nation and national sovereignty in the face of the spreading jihad, and discovers a certain amount of national self-confidence in France that is not present in Germany. At least since the emergency, and that is 9/11, the anti-German current has not been divided, but rather disintegrated. Criticism of the nation, it seems to some, has degenerated into the hobby horse of principle-ridden or demagogic people who hardly differ from the object point of view, while on the other hand all too many people reconcile themselves carelessly with the brutal reality of capitalist everyday life, if it is French, American, or otherwise Anglo-Saxon in form. The following quote, again from Joachim Brun's obituary of Johannes Agnoli in 2003, encapsulates the dilemma. To speak of the state in an elementary way implies avoiding any opposition between law and violence, between consensus and arbitrariness, between the Federal Constitutional Court and the Bundeswehr, the statehood of capital sovereignty, is the mediated unity of both moments. And the critique of politics, which Johannes Agnoli presented as a continuation, extension, and radicalization of Marx's critique of political economy in writings such as The Transformation of Democracy, 1967, or The State of Capital, 1975, aims to deny the state any legitimacy as an expression of either popular sovereignty or human rights. The simple fact about the state is that, where there is exploitation of man by man, the political form of this relationship can only be that of domination. It follows that the state is not a means to any end, except that of guaranteeing the accumulation of capital, and is not a lever to socialism, nor to a green alternative civil society. Johannes Agnoli drew the quintessence of this perspective and thus removed himself from the lofty circles of political science. It is not just a matter of better administering, democratizing, or socializing power, not a matter of sublating the state, it is a matter of destroying the state, of its abolition, of the communist abolition of anarchy in the stateless association, and of promoting reflection on a different form of social synthesis. For the state, as Agnoli turns against the author of the Principe, is anything but an anthropological existential, and the Leviathan of the citizen Hobbes is indeed the general untruth from which the behemoth could only arise in Germany. End of quote. This may sound nonsensical after September 11th, if not completely out of touch with the reality of the spread of jihad and Western appeasement. Nevertheless, this text is not outdated. What Brun called the red-green civil society at the time is now making itself felt as a cross-party supporter of Merkel's policy of open borders. This policy, pursued blindly and driven, but always with a self-righteous tremolo, is aimed at the dissolution of national sovereignty in favor of an eerie new state Moloch that is only beginning to emerge in the form of a shadowy outline. One that also integrates the elements of an emerging jihadist counter-society for the purpose of accumulating capital and thus merging consensus and arbitrariness into an autochthonous society of fear that can no longer distinguish between law and violence. Criticism of this emerging non-state cannot succeed with the melancholy euphemism of the still existing constitutional state. The same applies to the bowing to a nation that can no longer be seen as a union of individuals and free people, neither with reminiscences of bare-breasted Marianne and the flowers of evil, nor with the three bras recently hung on a Parisian balcony in the colors of the tricolor. It would be possible to insist on the opposition of law and violence against Brune, but only to the extent that the legal system in the late bourgeois state still shows a certain resistance to the immediate intervention of a state power acting on call. When the law is no longer capable of maintaining order without the immediate use of force, when it becomes dysfunctional for the rule of capital, which in a crisis can very well resort to a plebiscitally organized emergency dictatorship, then, but only then, does the difference between law and force disappear. What is missing in the Brune quote is the ideology critique which the same author does pursue elsewhere, which does not seek to replace the critique of the state, but to bring it up to the level of the non-revolutionary era. Too brash and lacking in mediation, too simple in a superficially charming way, Brune, with Agnoli, recommends the communist abolition of the state into the stateless association by means of the destruction of the state. Such statements are too strongly influenced by the poorly processed experience of the German autumn, but also see Agnoli's flirting with the Black Bloc at left-wing radical demonstrations in West Berlin in the 1980s and the inevitable chanting of fire and flame for this state, by the defiant imperative that, as a critic with revolutionary intentions, one should concern oneself with the essential, the destruction of the state. Even more questionable, however, is the call for a fundamental critique of politics that is supposed to promote the destruction of the state. In 2003, when Agnoli died, there were no real friends of politics making in anti-German circles. The Young Socialists, the Greens, the PDS Linkspartei have never attracted anyone from behind the stove, and only a few people have joined the shrinking civil movements for peace and ecology. The criticism of politics, as it relates to anti-German circles, cannot therefore have meant the open or bashful participation in the staging of national unity, such as the uprising of the decent, but rather the willingness of a large part of the so-called anti-Germans to welcome not only the Afghanistan campaign in 2002, but also the Iraq War a year later. If politics means the merging of one's own interests into an act of submission to a state program, as is usually the case, then it is to be rejected. But the at least conceivable bundling of interests for the purpose of forcing something from the state is not necessarily politics in the sense of the citizen's self-abandonment, which must be understood as both word and deed. Criticism ultimately wants to influence the minds of citizens, to tear them out of their blindness, to incite them to resist what is being done to them. It does not do so in order to prepare the better state, but ultimately always out of the interest, albeit one that is very far from being realized, of abolishing the untrue conditions altogether, if things are ever to get better. It gives itself up when it tiredly and ironically operates as the axis of the good, which Karl Popper has discovered for himself and to which it subscribes all kinds of deeply asocial liberal ideological set pieces, along with the corresponding practice. It not only does not give up, but does what it alone can do when it seeks to preserve and strengthen the functions of the state and aspects of the nation in extremely critical, not to say pre-fascist times. And that is where we live today. For even that, the mediation of rule through the rule of law, the maintenance of national sovereignty as a guarantor not only of the rule of law, but of the sheer possibility of moving freely and unhindered everywhere, are no longer taken for granted by bourgeois rule, but are unacknowledged and unloved relics of a bourgeois nation in the process of self-dissolution. The abolition of the latter, as it is currently emerging in the alliance between the government and the German helpers, would not be followed by any reflection on a different social synthesis, but by a panicked rallying under the strong hand of Angela Merkel's successors and their values, which are no longer only presented as necessary, but as the values of a pseudo-society that, in the name of cultural sensitivity and recognition, is abandoning the remnants of its already little-loved rule of law. Because anti-German criticism does not want to be the lament of the last liberal citizen about the inevitable decline of his values, it is not about nostalgia, but about accusation. This is not articulated in the then already hackneyed J'accuse gesture of an Émile Zola, but from the outside, as an attack on the daily meanness of a self-righteous, stupid public opinion, presented by those who do not belong to it. This also includes the comments of people who wave Israeli flags and at the same time want to hand over the murderer of the little refugee boy from the Berlin State Office for Health and Social Affairs to the just punishment of fellow inmates ready to lynch him. It is not about politics, but about politically motivated interventions that do not end with a perfectly good for communism, as the editors of Bahamas did for a long time, in order to reach those who are carried by the weakest of hopes, even those who are theoretically poorly educated and completely unrevolutionary. The anti-German circles, journals, and publishing houses are apparently held together by the imperative to be in solidarity with Israel, and this somehow connects the disparate parts. Yet Israel is a bourgeois state that jealously guards its sovereignty, whose citizens refer to it when they join politicians, and whose anti-state leftists long for its downfall. This state, and with it the vast majority of its Jewish citizens, basically wants nothing more than as many other bourgeois states as possible on its side, on which it can rely. But if Israel dreams that a universal principle is associated with the bourgeois nation, to which all peoples must adhere in their own interest, then it becomes quiet in anti-German circles. And when Israel proclaims the obvious, what we have to fight off every day at great cost is also your enemy, you can already feel it, then the uncertainty in anti-German circles is perfect. Then it becomes clear that the Jewish state is often only granted the right to exist by the anti-German left-wing radical milieu because of Auschwitz, and not as a natural expression of Western solidarity. In this way, the victims of the past are granted a kind of license to be self-accusing and self-righteous, the generous guarantors of which would not be able to defend the much older project of Zionist settlement in Palestine if the Holocaust had not occurred. In essence, the solidarity with Israel is often difficult to distinguish from the most sublime German state discipline, the lessons of history, which claims a special German path that led to a break in civilization that was as terrible as it was inexplicable, leaving behind an existential remnant that is called German guilt. The opinion-forming majority and thus also the state are denied by anti-Germans the approval of the assertion that one has found the way from the night to the light and made a royal road out of the special road. Nevertheless, Navid Kermani's speech on the 65th anniversary of the proclamation of the Basic Law in 2014, with its bow to a purified Germany, contains all the essential attributes of this solidarity with Israel merely turned into the positive. Quote, I am not prone to sentimentality when it comes to screens, and yet I felt the same as so many others when, on his 100th birthday, the recordings of a German chancellor were repeated who stepped back in front of the memorial in the former Warsaw Ghetto, hesitated for a moment and then, completely unexpectedly, fell to his knees. I still can't watch it without tears welling up in my eyes. And the strange thing is that, in addition to everything else, in addition to the emotion, the memory of the crimes, the amazement that is renewed each time, there are also tears of pride, of very quiet but nevertheless definite pride in such a federal republic of Germany. It is the Germany that I love, not the boastful, not the muscle-flexing, not the proud-to-be German Germany or the Europe finally speaks German Germany, but rather a nation that is desperate about its history, that struggles and quarrels with itself, even to the point of self-accusation. At the same time, it has matured through its own failures, no longer needs the pomp, modestly calls its constitution the Basic Law and prefers to be a little too friendly and naive towards foreigners than to fall prey to xenophobia and arrogance again. End of quote. This is Angela Merkel's credo. This is the affected justification for the state destruction of unimaginable proportions that is currently taking place. Not proud, not bravado, but quiet, self-accusing, struggling and struggling, yes, desperate but mature and therefore proud. That is Merkel Germany. Nothing in these attributes points to any quality of the Federal Republic of Germany as a state. Everything is a hollow gesture. This is how one must imagine a successfully completed course of treatment at Alcoholics Anonymous, when a person whose personality has been shattered by constant, senseless self-accusation can finally be released into the world, where he then modestly but insistently presents the example of his own insignificance as a merit to be imitated. Just as he reduces his former life to the devil of alcohol, so Germany presents itself as a lesson from history 70 years after the unconditional surrender, never again wanting to be xenophobic and therefore arrogant. Anyone who pointed out that the German genocide of Jews was not aimed at foreigners coming into the country, but at German citizens designated as pests to the nation, and that the slogan, "No concessions to anti-Semites," would be much more difficult to reconcile with the German welcome culture than the slogan, "Never again xenophobia," would undoubtedly be immediately labeled as xenophobe by a grand coalition of government, opposition, and refugee helpers. People who are supportive of Israel would probably be outraged by Kermani's report on the reformed Germany and would counter that everything is hypocritical and a lie, that behind the reformed facade is the unchanged collective of the people, which is just waiting to relapse into xenophobia, anti-Semitism, which Kermani has long since subsumed under racism and arrogance. And at the end, they even want to sing the song of death, which is better than life. Kermani, however, the government's assistant muezzin, has a better understanding of the character of the government's official German penance than those anti-Germans who still suspect the same hope for the Fourth Reich behind the most blatant transformations of that Volksgemeinschaft collective. That is why he calls for more Islam in the country as a pledge of successful self-education, and not a few anti-Germans have gladly taken up his package deal against all racism and anti-Semitism and project their well-kept despair about themselves as upright people suffering from the German conditions onto the Germans who would do a few million Muslim refugees just right as a punishment for Auschwitz, so to speak. Today, some chant Germany, you piece of shit, as the Black Bloc did recently in Hanover at a demonstration against the AfD party conference, which was also attended by high-ranking politicians, and others chant shit state, as happened at a citizens' meeting on November 26, 2015 in Lohfelden, district of Kassel, because of the establishment of a refugee shelter. Both are incredibly close in their mindless hostility towards the state. The former envy the state for doing what they have always demanded, namely opening the borders. The latter have long since adopted the jargon of the authoritarian tough guy Til Schweiger, even if they currently disagree with him, and revel in bullying political office holders, in this case the district president of Hanover. Both groups have long represented milieus that are held together by nothing but hatred of a state that appears to them as an impersonal, incomprehensible, and unjust machine, which they call a system in unbroken German tradition, and whose concrete functionaries, such as politicians or government officials, they have so far mainly targeted verbally. Both are happy to note that everything is changing, especially that the mediation of power no longer works in times of open borders and that it is now finally up to them. The helpers play the role of a counter-government by the grace of the government. The Pegida Germans play the role of a national revolution. The much-invoked values, which since November 13th have been understood as what distinguishes us from jihadists and what we should therefore defend, are not even known by those who do not think much of harassing politicians, who would never march in front of a refugee shelter and who certainly understand that refugees should not be allowed to freeze to death at the Macedonian border. However, they have no answer to the irrationalism of the government, which invokes the lessons of history, and they stare numbly at a state of emergency that they fear far less than the embarrassment of having to admit that the times since August 2015 have become eerie and threatening. These people do not love death any more than they love their mostly unfulfilling lives. They are just so self-conscious that they dare not name their own interests and, in a sense of hopelessness, wait for something to happen. This majority does not think much of Islam. A primary election among Berlin SPD members in November, for example, resulted in a clear yes to a headscarf ban for teachers, but they would never criticize it. If they thought about it, these same people would be able to list certain standards that guide coexistence in Germany and consider them worthy of defense, standards that are generally attributed to bourgeois nations. But they remain silent. Perhaps they are waiting for someone from the all-party coalition to present them with an alternative to the refugee crisis as a permanent state of emergency. This ominous silence, which cannot be broken, is what makes the times we are living in so dangerous. To tackle the fascistization that can be observed today without fascists, the abolition of the state without revolutionaries, indeed without any self-confident actors or arguments, would be the task of critics who know little more about the joy of life or the good life than that both are objectively denied to them. This is not only true of Marx but also of the state-distant, less revolutionary poets Balzac, Baudelaire, and Flaubert. At the end of a long search for emancipation, you are as alone as all those eternally young middle-class subjects who hang out in the same old hostels in the big cities, where they exchange the same old tricks and tips in their Spartan communal rooms, which help them to reduce the low budget with which they travel even further. On the Grand Tour, which is now completed as a staged survival struggle in the urban jungle, people always live in mutual ignorance. The people you meet in the trendy places are like you, the others are just decoration. But we are sure of one thing. We represent the new, better world. One person wrote it off his soul in Jungle World on May 19, 2016, even before Donald Trump was elected. But not only hipsters, expats and bankers in suits are part of the new world culture. A housemaid in Kuala Lumpur and a housemaid in Sao Paulo have very similar worries and needs and speak the same language, English. Those who work as disenfranchised cheap laborers on the high-rise construction sites of the global cities are also world citizens, but poor ones. Low-budget expats, construction workers, maids, taxi drivers, doctors, teachers, craftsmen, Erasmus students, EasyJet travelers, bankers, or refugees. They all meet in the cities and form new societies that are no less socially unjust, but like the whole economy have a new frame of reference. The nation, the state, traditional values play an increasingly smaller role in it. End of quote. The world as a hostel, the revolution, the conditions for which were kindly fought for by capital on our behalf, as the freedom to sit in an internet cafe, which represents the boundless space that is as empty and inhuman as the phrases that are typed into laptops there. Quote, instead of demonizing the globalization of culture and trying in vain to stop urbanization, it is high time from an emancipatory point of view to accept this new reality and to fight for left-wing, solidarity-based developments within it. The nation should be forgotten. The struggle for the cities so that they can be cities for everyone, but also their constant development and modernization, is the struggle for the future of emancipation. Left-wing, liberal, and conservative defenders of the West must learn to let go. Bye-bye, West. Now it's about the world. End of quote. The globalized nation-state is imploding. It will completely abandon the unproductive, give up protecting individual citizens against lawbreakers, and allow the infrastructure to decay. It is withdrawing as a state and, if at all, is governing in many countries as a party to the Civil War, because it has long since stopped representing the general public. And that is perfectly fine with more and more opinion makers in Germany, who may be enthusiastic about how well they speak English, but still preach the letting go and accepting of one's own destiny in a very German way. Quote, the world cities no longer claim to be metropolises, i.e. the center of a surrounding area, and to relate to the lagging periphery. Instead, they are linking up with other powerful metropolises where very similar technological, social, and cultural conditions prevail. World cities are becoming world powers. The nations are once again inflating themselves before they burst. What is happening now is their death throes. End of quote. Because the word welcome death throes does not only refer to the disintegration of a form of government, but also to the very mundane dying of more and more people in the megalopolises, as well as in the regions that are being delivered to ruin by them from hunger, curable diseases, or through the bullets of the gang's dash. Because the author, in view of his cynical celebration of the survival of the fittest, is worried that people might realize that he sympathizes with an order that is causing more and more people to die. He swings the academic Auschwitz club against every globalization-critical objection. Quote, because, of course, rootless cosmopolitans, world citizens, people who supposedly have a say in everything in the world, are at least potentially present everywhere, are the surrogate of every conspiracy theory and of primary anti-Semitism. End of quote. Anyone who has something to say against the destruction of civil communities in the name of mostly Islamic clique and self-help economies is therefore with the enemies of rootlessness, which is something that does not even exist. An Islamophobic anti-Semite, when in truth the friends of bourgeois uprooting cosmopolitans and world citizens, should be the first to fight a globalism that globalizes tribalism and barbarism. The socialization authority of the new society, celebrated in this way, are armed units that initially claim a monopoly on violence only for their homelands or neighborhoods, but as soon as they act globally, they mean limitless destruction. Formations such as the Islamic State and Boko Haram are the vanguard of such globalization, which is not only praised in Jungle World. The state, which has been reduced to metropolitan areas, follows a similar principle and either allows the areas that have been left behind to become deserted deserts or promotes their transformation into ganglands, in which the capital relationship only rules in a rudimentary way, because predatory economies are not capitalist. The globalized state renounces any regulatory intervention in the economy, whose agents it instead seeks to bind to itself with the promise of no longer wanting to do anything that constrains their actions. The renunciation of taxes and customs duties, of possibly protected national production, and the approval of the uninhibited import of goods produced under inhumane conditions elsewhere is nothing other than this. Among the citizens of such a state, what is now quite emancipatorily called new societies is becoming established. What is meant here are post-bourgeois conglomerates of subjects who are naturally related to one another, and who, as collectives, either fight against one another or just barely tolerate one another along demarcated claims. The English they speak is at a similarly primitive level as the language of their childhood, which they never really learned. The solidarity that these speechless people develop is that of unconditional submission to the blood law of their tribe, their culture, their religion, their neighborhood. The great cities, which we have no longer been able to dream of since the skyline of Kuala Lumpur began to resemble that of New York, are withering away into what is rightly called the global village, in which individuals are sorted according to race and not class, according to origin and not position in the production process, and in which the eternal law of obligatory prejudice, and not the slogan "city air makes you free," reigns. The big city no longer holds any promise, since the fantastic idea once symbolized by the skyscrapers of New York, that it is possible to live in luxury without being a slave to the image, in privacy and sociability on the basis of complete anonymity, has been refuted by the towers of the New World cities, in which the idea of the urban human being is being eradicated in the name of urbanity. At the end of a long journey, the locals, who are unable or unwilling to join in and often live in increasingly neglected backwoods, are the butt of the scorn of the successful, who are often not so successful in economic terms and rationalize their dislike of the provincial people only in their own fear of social decline. Globalization means an economy in whose metropolises the conditions for a bourgeois nation-state are already dwindling due to a lack of tax revenue, which also shatters the hopes of people in the third world of one day living in humane conditions on their own territory. The world economy is being worshipped, which allows production to take place where the omnipotence of the necessarily particular moral economy ensures that there are no uprisings, and in which the remnants of statehood are transferred to a completely or largely privatized security force, which is just responsible for ensuring that the roads are still passable for goods, the network for logistics is functional, and the labor slaves are there every day. The wretched, who are left with nothing but the need to sell themselves. Under this regime, people will become more equal in a somewhat different way than revolution theorists once imagined. They will be transformed into a dulled, fatalistic mass, whose subjects will not even know how to name the fate to which they are delivered, and in doubt will implore the murder and moral institutions that hold them captive to commit even more rigid acts of violence, as their executioners they offer themselves. How could they ever get free of their own captivation when those who were once called upon to do so, those who had still tried to explain the constraints from which one must free oneself and the goal to which one must aspire, now spit with hatred and contempt on the few who try to counteract with possibly inadequate means? Since Donald Trump was elected President of the United States, all inhibitions have fallen away, and what would still be kept under wraps in a bourgeois nation is breaking through, albeit only rhetorically. The threat of those who are not able to connect being abandoned with the withdrawal of their life cards, and the abandonment of critics who do not want to be to their deserved fate. The fight against the locals was long enough one of the modern state, which brutally leveled the particularism of entire population groups, but in its merciless actions it at least created the conditions for a bad, because capitalistically constituted, general public, which at least subjected the individual, who had been blown off from old ties, to the effective protection of the general law. Today, the memory of the subjugation of far-flung agrarian regions to the laws of commodity exchange and the central state returns in the mocking prejudice against the locals as an anti-national struggle against stubborn defenders of the better. The aim is to eradicate the memory of and also the hope for a state in which people in the city and in the countryside related to each other as necessarily limited individuals in the regulation of public affairs and in the class struggle. The bourgeois nation created the conditions for emancipation, that is, the reduction of the human world of conditions to the human being himself, so that it could even be thought of. Above all, it was this bourgeois nation that allowed the critic to carry out his subversive business in isolation. In the truly global hate songs against the locals, on the other hand, only the evil, totalitarian moment of bourgeois socialization appears. Yet it is the calls for unreserved submission to the capital relation, hurled against the world in an empathic sense, and not the mostly helpless objections to its senseless execution, which are currently ideologically securing the bad sublation of nation and law. Where the seemingly liberated human being can only think of himself in his bloated atrophy, all borders disappear. The disintegration of the human species into an increasing number of ethnic, cultural, and sexual identities, each of which demands respect and an absolute ban on criticism, indicates that the truly individual human being, who would be called upon to take back the abstract citizen within himself and who recognizes and organizes his own powers as social powers, as Marx had still hoped, can no longer be spoken of. Rather, the ideologues of decline are declaring war not on the abstract citizen, but on abstraction itself, and thus on cooperation between individuals and free people, and consequently rejecting self-organization based on common interests. The modern metropolis, which has been decried as a Moloch by the losers of modernization in the past, does not take the place of the constitutional state. Rather, the old resentment is transferred to the celebration of the postmodern megacity, which appears as a self-sufficient organism that dictates to people how they can survive in it alone. The boundless emptiness extolled as cosmopolitanism, which begins just beyond the disappearing city limits, corresponds to the fantasies of omnipotence of powerless ideologues. The men of the future, who recognize only themselves, as the room-mate in Kuala Lumpur, this victim of her Malaysian master, who is at the mercy of the law at all times, and who, as supposed conquerors, are in reality unabashed euphemists of the eternal laws of capital. Quote, "It is not enough to tell racists and homophobes how stupid they are, but you must not make the mistake of turning to them with understanding. Rather, it is important to fight for the vision of a world community that is emancipating itself together, and to create the social and societal conditions for this. Globalism for all is the slogan of the struggle, and so is, fuck the locals." End of quote. No one has ever more shamelessly offered themselves to the institutions of the dwindling power of the state, the agencies of a culture of acceptance for new societies, and no one should say that the simple-minded Ivo Bozic or the newspaper for which he writes is not interchangeable. You have to give Jungle World credit for being a veritable avant-garde of globalization, like Der Spiegel and Die Zeit, Süddeutsche Zeitung and Taz. Nowhere is the sorting into higher and lower races more natural than where every notion of universality has been abolished, as it is still guaranteed by the law in the bourgeois state, that is, in the globalized world. In Kuala Lumpur, which Bozic happily welcomes into the community of globalists, social existence is secured under conditions dictated by Islamic race and religious law. Nowhere is homophobia more of a hard and fast rule than in places where the bourgeois nation has abdicated or was never established. Emancipation there is the path from general to particular law, which rejects the free, unbound individual as a legal subject and delivers him to the violence of ethnicized gangs. One must describe such conditions with and against Bozic as a community, indeed a world community. For the word community, which is counter-civilizing, preserves the terrible proximity of partly forced, partly unconcernedly voluntary self-abandonment, while at the same time demanding unconditional respect for one's own self-establishment in a collective state without history. Where society only exists in the plural, cosmopolitanism is liquidated, contrary to what the smooth talkers of globalization would have us believe. This is because it refers to world citizenship, which one might also call world proletariat, for whom the law, the comparison of free individuals and the finiteness of rationally organized territories are conditions of existence. Emancipation, the overused word that only means liberation from constraints and does not positively define the better human being, becomes its opposite, a fetter and entanglement in ever more constraints, where its prerequisites have disappeared. And historically and currently, these lie in the liberation of large, but precisely defined territories, separated from others, from the violence of highwaymen, robber barons, and tribal associations, and thus in the liberation from pre-bourgeois prejudice and arbitrariness through the monopolization of all power under the bourgeois constitutional state. The fatalistic endpoint of the long road of post-bourgeois history into the self-chosen abyss is marked by the new self-constraint of the late bourgeois nation, which is still bound to this principle in form and institution, for the sole reason of wishing the scab on its neck because it is territorially limited and thus proto-fascist. Where no startup can conceal the fact that the free exchange of goods, which Marx presupposed as the basis for all emancipation, has long since been consigned to the past, and that the organization of social production by finally liberated subjects is further away than ever, it remains incomprehensible with what matter-of-factness it is abandoned. What guarantees that at least one can lead a better life than the inhabitants of the much-admired megacities, who vegetate under the conditions of immediate and incalculable violence, whose goings-on one watches with fascination from the internet cafe? What is being demanded everywhere today and even welcomed as an opportunity for renewal, the withdrawal of the bourgeois state into a multitude of particular societies whose members are called upon to regulate their own destinies in a completely communitarian way, because neither the real community clears away the rubbish nor the public order office sends out appointed guards against the people who dump rubbish, means the perversion of capitalist socialization on a civil society basis. The entire contempt for the self-organized and thus immediate neighborhood affects those who do not participate and withdraw from the tedious events to determine the next, more far-reaching goals. Society, as an abstractly functioning and institutionally secured procedure that is only committed to common sense, is thus reversed into a community that always reserves the right to take coercive action against deviants. Elsewhere, communitarianism has long since meant the authoritarian formation of society on the basis of pre-capitalist, or rather post-capitalist, principles, and thus the unleashing of particular violence to maintain not only production and distribution, but also unquestioned community terror. Equipped with communist, even value-critical tools, one can talk up this apocalyptic execution without subjects as a necessary and welcome path to the Big Bang, which finally sets the classless and stateless individuals free, who then come together across all divisions to sensibly organize the world. But one should not, because everyone could know that such a prognosis has no basis in reality. Those who do not want to go that far come to a similar conclusion because of their own sins against the colonized or decolonized world with its supposedly humiliated races and peoples. The flow of immigrants is unstoppable. The borders cannot be closed once they have been opened. We just have to come to terms with the new societies, whose stormtroopers are currently only whipping Jews who wear kippot, beating transvestites from the street with iron bars and molesting or raping unaccompanied Western women in deserted subway shafts, women who are then mockingly advised by the state to take taxis at night. What they would otherwise only accuse the parasitic baby boomers of in a fit of malicious envy, the globalists are cheerfully doing themselves in this way. Through scrupulous inaction, decisions are being made that will be at the expense of future generations. Anyone who is 30 or older and lives in Germany today may grow old in a gated community, but unlike their descendants, they will not be completely at the mercy of the societies they did not want to oppose when there was still time. Revolutionaries and conservative fatalists agree with Wolfgang Schäuble's dictum, which could just as easily have been said by Ivo Bozic. We are always wrong if we do not want to accept the changes that are taking place. We have to live with the changes and try to shape them. We cannot stop the course of history. Everyone has to come to terms with the fact that Islam has become part of our country. End of quote. The point of the statement is that Islamization is a necessary and absolutely acceptable consequence of the course of the world, because in contemporary Islam, more than anywhere else, what the globalist need desires is taking place. The convergence of transnationalization and retribalization, the dissolution of the nation-state and the boundlessness of authoritarian, if necessary murderous, care. Those who do not share the wild desire for destruction nevertheless shy away from calling for the consequences that he or she, together with as many others as possible, would have to demand from the state in particular. Instead, even those who have no illusions about what the acceptance of parallel societies already means in the Federal Republic of Germany today resort to cautious comments that always manage without demands, thus making themselves complicit. The looming collapse of the Berlin education system, in which, as the moderators put it, religious conflicts are increasingly emerging, this spreading school jihad, to which not only Jewish children but also all teachers who take their profession seriously are exposed, is the result of the unprecedented brutalization of hundreds of thousands of members of the Turkish immigrant community who voluntarily embrace Islam. Birth statistics in Germany show an enormous increase from this milieu, which has been increasingly supplemented by refugee children since 2015, in whose minds, in whose souls and in whose drive development parents, relatives and neighbors deliberately and unhindered by the state and society sow the evil seed of Islam, if it still needs to be sown at all. The solution cannot possibly lie in gently encouraging the increasingly unteachable to show consideration and reflection. The instruction would have to be authoritarian, not only threatening with sanctions but also imposing them, up to and including the withdrawal of custody for jihadist-minded parents. It makes no sense to point out in well-mannered debates that the mass spread of the headscarf does not just provide a disgusting role assignment for women and girls. Rather, it would be more accurate to state that women and girls are empowered by the headscarf to shine a light on German sluts, together with their inevitable brothers and cousins. The headscarf should be banned for teachers and students in all educational institutions, from kindergarten to university, and for those employed there, in all public authorities. To demand this is undoubtedly to interfere in the sphere of the state with the aim of organizing a majority for the repressive measures mentioned. But is that the role of a critic? Would that not be to cast out the green devil with the end of the brown Beelzebub? Isn't the attempt to counter fate with state power the entanglement of criticism in an even greater fate? In anti-German circles, it was long frowned upon to make politics, and it is even more frowned upon to interfere in the capitalist economy on a capitalist basis. There is much truth in this. Politics must be rejected insofar as it means the incapacitating bundling of individual interests that only serves to maintain the status quo and to blunt any criticism that has been applied to them, for example, to provide the anti-Semitic Marat from the Berlin primary school with a school social worker and to suggest to the parents of the threatened Mirjam, in the name of respect for new societies, that they have their daughter educated elsewhere. In an anti-fascist and communist spirit, that is, as the upholders of bad conditions that absolutely must be defended against the global multitude, in which every Irfan has an Evo at his side, one could counter anti-politicians with a note of cautious optimism. But democracy has not become so established that people really experience it as their own thing, that they know themselves as subjects of political processes. It is perceived as one system among others, as if one had the choice on a sample card between communism, democracy, fascism, monarchy, but not as identical with the people themselves, as an expression of their maturity. Demanding intervention in the capitalist economy becomes an expression of barbarism when it is meant to compulsively exorcise its inherent crisis. However, the anathemas against all efforts to give the capitalist economy a different framework, one that is more pleasing to wage earners and possibly even to society, by means of a decree, i.e. by incorporating it into laws or collective agreements, appear strange. If the critique of politics leads to the demonization of any intervention, even organized intervention in social developments that have been recognized as disastrous as a potentially national socialist project, then it is high time to break with an abstract dogmatism that many have themselves once adhered to. The reservations that are so fond of being formulated in anti-Semitism theory, and that want to be schooled in Franz Neumann's behemoth or have misappropriated the term post-fascism from Clemens Nachtmann in order to provide dishonest absenteeism with theoretical consecration, always come back to the same disaster. The point is to insinuate that the state, which is intervening and is also post-fascist, would, even if it were to confront Islamic fascism, end up with a formed Volksgemeinschaft, that is, a reprise of National Socialism and thus a new Holocaust, the prospective victims of which this time are perfidiously presented as Jews and Muslims, as if the latter were not currently the potentially greatest threat to the former. In such dogmatic certainties, criticism of a state based on the rule of law, which is in itself in a state of despair, becomes blurred with criticism of the threateningly emerging non-state. The current state of the Federal Republic of Germany only comes up in such criticism of post-fascism, to the extent that, critical of Israel and anti-German, one adopts the ban decreed by public opinion that, out of a sense of responsibility for German history, one must not take action against Islam. A fatalism emerges in this that is compatible with Bozick's praise of globalization. Anti-German criticism is still strongly influenced by the polemic against the social democratic welfare state and its regulatory mania of the 1970s and early 1980s, which went hand in hand with thousands of hastily created professorships, whose holders, increasingly authoritarian, transformed criticism into ideology. Those who later called themselves anti-Germanists initially only broke with left-wing reformism after 1968, without joining the idiotic K-groups. If they had merely broken ranks with the Marx-schooled anti-reformists when they believed that reunification would not only lead to the resurgence of the German nation-state, and thus, in relation to their own left-wing past, identified anti-Semitism as necessarily inherent in the concept of the nation-state, they would no longer be talked about. Anti-German criticism without the acid test of Israel, and thus the decisive break with any anti-imperialism and any cheap criticism of the state, would not even be of interest to archivists today. In its solidarity with Israel, anti-German criticism has gradually abandoned a communist goal whose advocates struggled in despair and bitterness with the fact that neither the final crisis nor the new National Socialism wanted to happen and, to make matters worse, no one could be won over for the revolutionary project. After September 11th, the necessary and the confessional were eliminated from anti-German criticism, and since then it has been left to the readers and listeners of the critical interventions to judge for themselves whether the revival of a fascist people's state is being called for, or the preservation of the conditions for liberation. Solidarity with Israel is betrayed when the dogmatic criticism of the state, which is no longer very different from angry, dogmatic hostility towards the state, is only able to grant the Jewish state, the bourgeois capitalist Jewish state, a niche in the otherwise sealed system of hostility towards the state, a generously granted special role that almost inevitably entails pressures to show solidarity with Israel. For a long time, critics of Israel who were supportive of the country maintained a difficult compromise, which at least suggested that the United States, as the winner of the Second World War under a president who had suffered under Roosevelt, and as a dedicated protector of Israel, was acting in a way that made sense, at least in terms of foreign policy. Since Donald Trump became president of the United States and actually wants to follow in Roosevelt's footsteps in terms of economic policy, it is clear that the United States is also in the hands of quasi-fascist racketeers who, to add to all the misery, also want to close a border. Israel itself was spared the solidarity-based criticism of anti-German anti-Israel activists this spring, because the government's attempt to deport African men of predominantly Islamic background who had entered the country illegally, which was supported by an overwhelming majority of the population, has failed for the time being. What is called for is the completely improper. The intervention of anti-German critics in the country's political affairs with the anti-fascist and world citizen intention of forcing the bourgeois states, yes, even and above all the German state, to confront globalization in Europe in the Islamic variety with robust threats and, if necessary, repressively at their borders and, where necessary, in alliance with the USA beyond the borders, just as they do at home, so that at least situations like the one in France, where the pious torture and murder of Jews is covered up by an anti-racist left-wing cartel, cannot be repeated. But we should also demand that the Israeli government and the father of the schoolgirl who was threatened with death in Berlin-Tempelhof finally take the Israeli government's warnings seriously. Israeli politicians never tire of emphasizing that what is happening in Germany in a hostile, brutal, and land-grabbing manner is the everyday reality in a country besieged by these perpetrators, and that Europe would be well advised to do something about it for that reason alone. It was important for the father of the Jewish girl to be told that what was done to his daughter was not only directed at Jews, but increasingly at all white, Western students and teachers. But the more criticism of the state is transformed into crude hostility towards the state, and the more every authority is cast as a per se hostile so-called domination, the more stubbornly anti-German theory producers warn against politics, provided that this is understood as meaning more and something other than advertising for the Amadou Antonio Foundation and related agencies of current government policy. For other anti-Germans, who are not swayed by their solidarity with Israel, barbarism already appears to be a contradiction-free space of personal happiness, in which nothing is forced upon you and you are finally allowed to let go. What once defined the citizen and made the communist critic possible. The somewhat successful processing of coercion, which is a prerequisite for individuation even in young children and should accompany them throughout their lives in the form of the sublimation of the most primitive drives, this imposition, without which individuality is not possible, is now constantly being subsumed under the urgent need to abolish the harassment of civilization. This is the message of the truly anti-authoritarian spokesman of the post-national multitude, who, with Ivo Bozic, cry out in liberation, "Bye-bye West," only to add, in a thoroughly authoritarian manner, "Fuck the locals." In January 2015, the non-commercial American TV channel C-SPAN released a compilation of television recordings of an appearance by Joe Biden, who was then the 47th Vice President of the United States under Barack Obama. The collage shows examples of Biden's touchiness, which is regularly scandalized by Republican opponents, which had occurred on the fringes of a swearing-in ceremony in the U.S. Senate. In the scenes, which were edited together with an obvious denunciation in mind, Biden hugs and pats mostly underage women who had attended the ceremony as family members of senators and extras, gives them kisses or sniffs their hair. The collage of scenes was used by Donald Trump supporters in later presidential election campaigns to demonstrate that the accusations of sexual harassment against Trump were countered by comparable, if not even more problematic behavior by Biden towards female minors. While the accusations against Trump were on a par with the rape allegations against film producer Harvey Weinstein, because they amounted to accusations of sexual exploitation and blackmail of women in economically and politically subordinate positions, the accusations against Biden were aimed at insinuating pedophilic tendencies. While the accusations against Trump, even where they have not been legally confirmed, have been added to an endless moral register of sins by left-wing, left-liberal, and bourgeois media and are still being passed on today, the same media have made the accusations against Biden a topic of discussion as fake news, thus appropriating precisely the same questionable label that Trump is regularly accused of using. The fact that Biden's touchiness is a favorite topic among conservative Republicans is probably not only due to puritanical resentment, but also a reaction to the unequal judgment of the Republican and Democratic old white man's communicative insinuations. It is no coincidence that Biden's and Trump's salacious remarks are not only weighted differently, but that the accusations also relate to different social constellations. Rather, it is crucial to the question of why Biden's inadequate behavior is taken less seriously than Trump's. The difference has less to do with the different party memberships of the two than with the fact that Biden and Trump represent two complementary manifestations of the social character of the old white man. Both characters are already decay products of that heteronormative, binary, patriarchal gender typology that postmodernism, brainwashed by gender theory and postcolonialism, regards as a specific feature of Western thought. Trump, who has a life and career history linked to the American entertainment industry, which is still referred to as a cultural industry in an ahistorical recourse to the dialectic of enlightenment, is nevertheless measured against the ideal type of the tycoon, Hollywood producer, or entertainer of the bourgeois era. His behavior is too inelegant, too unbound, and too coarse to pass as the last heir to this genealogy. The accusation of narcissism that has been raised against him at least captures this aspect of his social character accurately. Even his ability to make fun of himself and thus relativize his rudeness towards political opponents is more a sign of self-love that doubles back on itself than of self-distance. Trump's organic fusion with digital media, his fixation on his cell phone, which merges his private and political existence, and the replacement of press releases and other self-explanations with short messages, all point to him as an exemplary embodiment of the postmodern and not the bourgeois era. But while Trump's incessant digital activity at least reminds us that the post-Fordist type of entrepreneurially successful, flexible human being would not have been conceivable without the bourgeois entrepreneurial activity from which it emerged and to whose liquidation it contributes by selling off its inheritance, on the other hand, Biden stands for a wise nebulous inflexibility and senile meditative refusal to act, which in turn are specific to the post-bourgeois era. Although he is reminiscent of social studies teachers, progressive educators, and left-wing evangelical pastors who accompanied bourgeois society as a shadow, not only in his touchiness, he differs from them, whose German examples included figures such as Heiner Geisler, Friedrich Schorlemer, and Erhard Epler, in his symptoms of incapacity bordering on disability. While Geisler, Schorlemer, and company owed their popularity to the fact that they appeared as idealistic overall carers in lifelong honorary positions, Biden is particularly popular with the Germans because he himself is perceived as a care case and almost as one. This is not only evident from the role of Vice President in Kamala Harris, who acts as both an employee and a guardian alongside him and, in this dual character, as a subordinate and a supervisor represents precisely the soft, extortionate authority that has taken the place of contract-based, factual hierarchies in a civil society that has degenerated into a community of care and supervision. The educational reformer in the style of Geisler still embodied the traditional bourgeois authority, which was insecure and therefore approached the sovereign in a caring manner, but nevertheless traditional. The fact that this authority has now become the object of care and, in the person of Biden in sharp contrast to Trump's overbearing behavior, is declared by fact and character checkers to be the epitome of respectability, marks the transition from the late bourgeois to the post-bourgeois, from the post-democratic to the pre-totalitarian era. This is also why Biden's appearances evoke the pitiful and uncanny television appearances of Boris Yeltsin rather than those of a reliable representative of the world's largest bourgeois democracy. The fact that Trump appears to be the opposite of a care case and a carer, especially in the unpleasant facets of his character, is likely to be an important reason why Biden's alleged intrusiveness is met with a different reaction than Trump's. The sexual power that Trump is said to possess, and which he also embodies to some extent, represents a sovereignty that can exploit dependencies precisely because its objects first have to seek protection in the form of legal security and social support. He does not appear under the guise of protection, of reconciliation-seeking affection, or of sexuality transcending unclehood, which, as an aged manifestation of the beautiful soul, seems less dangerous than the late blooming and therefore overwrought virility of the white old fart. It is precisely those gestures in which Trump falls back behind the civility of the bourgeois social character and seems like a parody of the Republican he is mimicking, his crudeness, indecency, and self-adulation, that recall the connection between institutional power and real rule, between office and officeholder, which must be hidden from view by any abstract apology for bourgeois statehood. Biden, on the other hand, adequately embodies the awakened and sensitive manifestation of social domination in that he executes it as its subject with sovereignty. The world is an institution, all its inmates are lifelong cases, the only difference being that their supervisor is himself the object of his own supervision. The moment of self-transcendence that was inherent in bourgeois sovereignty, at least potentially, is thus cancelled. Self-empowerment seems to be possible only at the price of arbitrary self-disempowerment. In this sense, Biden can be seen, if not in realpolitik, then in the history of the political imaginary, as a representative figure of a transition from a Western to a post-Western society. The history of imagination does not simply examine the forms of ideological self-reflection of real history. Rather, the ways in which the members of societies dream, fantasize, or hallucinate about themselves have a changing and sometimes revolutionary effect on the psychosocial and economic conditions and are thus themselves a productive force. Whether the members of a society, when reflecting on themselves, remembering the past and projecting the future, set the reality principle as the absolute standard of knowledge of reality or suspend it, what significance the imagination has in determining the relationship between the individual and society, and what role nostalgia plays as an imaginary revocation of the past. All of this is not merely a reflection of existing conditions, but the law of motion of their self-transformation. If the history of the political imagination is written from this perspective, the actors are no longer interchangeable subjects of the events that take place, but their accidental quirks, tics, and pathologies are indispensable moments of the objective function that they fulfill in the process of socialization that passes over them and yet through them. It is probably because he had a keen sense of the interweaving of historical reality with the imagination, which reflects it and changes it, that Ernst Bloch developed a theory of dreams in his work The Principle of Hope, which was first published in the GDR in 1954 and then in the FRG in 1959. In stark contrast to Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams, Bloch sought to protect the supposedly progressive daydream from the night dream, which fraternizes with regression, privation, and restoration, or rather to keep it in custody. For Bloch, the daydream is an agent of anticipatory consciousness, which, in an imaginative historical analogy to the socialist planned economy, is constantly busy projecting and making plans, working imaginatively but with a materialist grounding to build a better future, even when its bearers are fishing, sunbathing, or scrambling through the Alps. In contrast, the night dream and sleep as the gateway to the unconscious represent those bourgeois impulses that, as a physical reaction to the implacability of the reality principle and as a residue of passivity, intimacy, and self-forgetfulness, carry within them everything that would be overcome in a communist society that had once become reality. The fact that people in the states of the fruit block still sleep and dream would, in this sense, be a symptom of their continued wrongness. Liberated humanity would have no nightmares and certainly no nightmares. In contrast to the abysmal nightmares expressing the contradictions of the bourgeoisie and the forced optimism of daydreams, the American dream, which Bloch does not mention, is strangely extraterritorial. The regressive pull of infantile desires, past generations and corpses buried in the cellar, whose symbolic integration into American culture was largely achieved by immigrants and exiles who conveyed the corresponding imaginary iconography with the American one archetypical of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho 1960, are largely alien to the regular guy and popular girl, whom Theodore W. Adorno expressed dislike for in Minima Moralio in the sense of a defense of the European social character and Freudian psychoanalysis. In this respect, there is an affinity between the American dream and Bloch's daydream, as some features of the pragmatist reception of psychoanalysis in the USA are reminiscent of its much more brutal censorship in the Eastern Bloc. On the other hand, because it conceives of the realization of the right general as mediated by individuals who associate with one another of their own free will, the American dream is directed against all socialist and state capitalist notions of the new man, which is why it is quite friendly towards Freud's idea of strengthening the ego both against its being overpowered by semi-conscious and unconscious impulses and against a principle of reality hypostatized as a principle of socialization. Perhaps for this reason, American society is more flexible in dealing with the contradiction expressed in the opposition between daydream and night dream, which Bloch, in a typically European way, took seriously and with pathos. In the New World, the individual is more likely to be trusted to integrate contradictions and to come to terms with the result, rather than to be so offended by them that they destroy themselves. In this respect, the American dream, unlike Bloch's daydream, actually aims to reconcile individual claims to happiness with the general, in whose medium they are to be realized, a reconciliation that, in historical reality, has usually taken the form of the individual's voluntary adaptation to the conventions of the general. The self-parodying erosion that the ideal of rough individualism, of the individual personality asserting itself in liberal competition, experienced in the type of Donald Trump, has already clearly shown that even in America itself, that dream was only able to take on a demolished form. If Biden, in Trump's place, now takes the place of the statesman as a carer in need of care, this indicates the possibility that the American dream could only survive in the future in the form of a twilight that belongs neither to the sphere of falling asleep nor of waking up, but to half-sleep. The dawning realization that the West is losing the ability to act on its own behalf because the means to do so now seem to it to be nothing more than the instruments of violence, relics of a despicable colonialism, imperialism, racism, and chauvinism, is misunderstood by its apologists, who are more defensive than convinced, as attentiveness. As a sign of wisdom, when in fact it is an expression of a conformism that is both lacking in courage and advice. Because they do not want to accept the self-transformation of America, which is being noted with a kind of loving sadism in Europe, with the exception of a few Eastern European countries, anti-German and liberal America friends are addressing it, if at all, on the basis of Biden's lack of assertiveness, the medical equivalent of which is the approaching dementia. While Trump's comparatively stable constitution is used as an additional argument for the fact that the narcissist can be trusted even less politically and intellectually than before, Biden's lack of fitness is considered the only valid reason for his possible imminent resignation. In fact, the decline in fitness is the individual expression of the emerging abdication of a West whose citizens, instead of fighting for what they recognize as the truth, are only supposed to care about each other, in which the pursuit of individual happiness has been replaced by Foucault's care for oneself, elevated to the negative principle of socialization. And the mutual respectful siege is the only thing that still holds the social atoms together, recognizing each other as powerless cases in need of care. In that he embodies this constellation in a flawless way, the old white man Biden differs from the old white man Trump, who has always refused to shrink to the symptom of what he witnessed. Almost 8 years before Biden's inauguration as the 46th President of the United States in January 2021, a more woke version of white male seniority took the place of Trump, a change that, in retrospect, seems like the European anticipation of such self-westernization. When Pope Benedict XVI was replaced as head of the Roman Catholic Church by Pope Francis, it was not just a representative of Latin American Catholicism and a friend of multicultural understanding who took the place of a conservative suspected of being ossified by orthodoxy. Rather, the representative of a woke seniority also replaced the representative of an incorrigible stubbornness of old age. Whether Benedict XVI, who died in 2022, can really be considered a defender of the indivisible concept of truth in theological and philosophical terms, as he was regarded by many at the time, may be doubtful. Karl-Heinz Haag considers Joseph Ratzinger's theological writings to be attempts to popularize Catholic orthodoxy by cozying up to ecumenism, and accuses them of a bad nominalism. What is indisputable is that, by renouncing mass-appealing performative antics and by his commitment to the word, to tradition and to ritual, he demonstrated a universalistic rigidity that his successor's empty dialogic pathos lacks. Even the decision not to hold his office for life, but to retire early for the purpose of reading and reflection, was still committed to the spirit of the tradition, even though it broke with it. Francis is also exemplary in terms of his wakeful old age and permanently agile senility, in that he even takes the fact that he is now dependent on a wheelchair as an opportunity for playful jokes and an indestructible optimism for progress. He neither allows himself to be overwhelmed nor enlightened by the symptoms of the transience of the body, but rather activates them by reading the wheelchair as a contemporary version of the papal throne. Such a flirtatious conflation of clerical and secular iconography, of elevation and disability, seems like a postmodern variant of a pagan village Catholicism and accommodates the regressive rationality of people who have always found the useless trappings with which popes and emperors surround themselves ridiculous and, at best, plausible as a means of concealing immobility and laziness. Unlike his predecessor, however, Francis, who has already demonstrated his proximity to superstition and second-hand nature religion through his enthusiastic participation in rain dances and other autochthonous folk dances, has forgotten any difference between representation and performance even before taking office and will probably be flitting through the Vatican like a male model from the pharmacy magazine until shortly after his own twilight years. In this activism, accompanied by a good mood, the good old white man of the clergy differs from the good old white man of world politics. For as much as he resembles Francis in that age does not show itself in him as stubbornness, but rather as transfiguration and slight confusion, so obviously the woken Pope's activist zest for life in old age is replaced in Biden by symptoms of failure, lapses of memory and errors of judgment, in a word, the failure of old age. This reflects the continuing difference between secular and clerical power at the moment of its abdication. While the president of the Western world power, increasingly surrounded by anti-Western agitators, spokespersons, and think tanks, voluntarily makes himself the nursing victim of his administration, to the applause of a following hostile to the cause he should be standing up for, the head of the former clerical supremacy of the West resigns. By mutating into the lair of the superstitious mob, applauded by irreligious fans of all religions. In contrast to their predecessors, both good old white men of the woken West thus become allegories of resignation, devoid of any resistance, as was sometimes the case with earlier forms of abdication and retreat. In contrast to people who, in ignorance of the history of the concept, call all enemies of the West barbarians, in order to suggest that civilization never creates its enemies from within itself, but faces them in a Manichaean trial by combat, Hans Blumenberg analyzed a topos of literature, philosophy, and visual art in his 1979 study of the history of the concept, Shipwreck with Spectators, in which a motif characteristic of Western thought on the threshold between the early modern and modern periods is condensed. For Blumenberg, the metaphor of the catastrophic shipwreck, which is registered by a spectator observing the scene from a helpless but also safe distance, becomes a symbol of the contradictory relationship between the subject of experience and knowledge and its object. The subject can only recognize the object of observation, which in this case is the catastrophe, because its distance from it is great enough not to be absorbed by it, let alone destroyed. Conversely, the distance to the object must not be too great, lest the distanced affectation turn into indifference. In this sense, the metaphor of the shipwreck with spectators contains the germs of the aporia of aesthetic experience, epistemological reflection, moral judgment, and practical action, which henceforth determine Western consciousness. The spectator of the shipwreck, as Blumenberg's account shows, reflects on the perspective from which he is observing the event and thus on his own involvement in the shipwreck that he is witnessing. Only through such self-reflection does witnessing become witnessing. The post-Western gaze with which the part of the Western world that hates civilization, but loves the global South for the fact that hatred is still authentic there, views the shipwreck that the last specimens of the old white man no longer even suffer, but commit in a good mood, does not maintain a compassionate distance from its object, but a self-satisfied one. Sympathy presupposes identification with that which is being sympathized with, the awareness that one could find oneself in the same situation as those being observed, under different circumstances. But the anti-Western propagandists in the West mock anyone who reminds them that those they are helping to discard stand for something that affects humanity. Guided by the maxim, affirmed from Nietzsche to postmodernism, that one must push what is already falling, they equate progress with the joyful destruction of the passing. In doing so, they, like all monsters, want to exorcise from themselves and from the world every impulse of salvation that still holds on to a trace of what is rightly disappearing, because even the bad that has rightly disappeared must be remembered, so as not to forget the best.